That night, the light of the stars in the sky was eclipsed by a castle blazing with fire in the middle of the desert, which had almost burned to the ground, releasing black soot into the sky. The castle was burning with bright tongues of flame, and you could hear the crackling of wood from which sparks flew like shots. A sign at the entrance to the castle stated that the Sima clan resided here. The sign with the inscription could not withstand the force of the fire, and the burning one collapsed right behind the walking men, one of whom was old and the other was holding the old man by the arm, and in front of them there were many dead bodies lying on the ground. In front of the men stood a creepy man from whom a green glow emanated, and behind this terrible man stood an army of people wearing red capes on their heads so that their faces could not be seen, and he told them that they tried to escape, but now they were still standing in front of him. The men were stained with blood, which indicated their struggle, and the old man, who was still being held by the younger man, stepped forward to say something to the big man. The monster, in the likeness of a man, also had a green glow in its eyes, and an evil smile stretched across its face when it saw that the old man wanted to object to something. The elder swore at the big man, shouting at him how dare he do such a thing, and had he really completely forgotten about the commandments of the teachings. The old man, because he was angry and screamed, began coughing up blood, clearly being wounded and already very weak, and the man who picked up the old man shouted his father in fear. The old man fell to his knees, exhausted, and with him his son, which greatly amused the creepy man who was still standing and watching them. The killer, showing a terrible grin, told the old man that he did not remember anything from the commandments of the teaching, except the part where it was said about strength. The unfortunate student decided to immediately show what he was capable of, and putting his hand forward, used his strength, from which the old man could only cover himself with his hand for protection. Green tongues crawled from the killer's hand in the direction of the old man, but the son was not going to just give up and decided to resist it. The son repelled the attack of the green flame with a bright light, putting one hand forward and holding his weak father with the other. The big man, turning indifferently to the old man, said that the time had come for him to throw away his life and that he would help him get rid of the pain. The student's plan to kill his teacher was interrupted by one of the subjects who shouted to the owner that he had found the one he needed, dragging in his hand an immobilized body and bloody clothes. Father and son looked at the heartbreaking picture of one of their sons being dragged away. The man furiously shouted for these monsters to immediately let his brother go, and the father stood nearby, grief-stricken, and did not want to accept what he saw. The old man felt bad again, and he knelt down and his son sat down next to him, and the student, happy that he took what he wanted, turned around to approach the subject who was still holding the body by the scruff of the neck like a rag, and said that this is the one they need. The young man was unconscious and his head hung, which did not bother the tyrant at all, and he said that they very easily obtained the valuable ingredient. The student wanted to look at the victim, and with the words, "Let me look at your face," he approached the body and grabbed the long hair. The tyrant saw in front of him the face of a rather young boy whose eyes were large, and although dimmed because he was unconscious, they had a beautiful purple color. The killer saw the young man's weak state and voiced that he could barely breathe. The guy's gaze was directed into nowhere and seemed dead and cold, and not a single muscle on his face shuddered. But somewhere deep in the boy's body, a force arose that was bright and emanated a purple glow. And this power did not take long to wait, but manifested itself in full force, which returned the violet color to the guy's eyes and life and energy to his body. In the boy's eyes, at the moment of the return of power, one could see the birth of a new galaxy. It was so powerful. Taking a loud and sharp breath of air, the guy came to life and opened his eyes wide. It was as if the dullness in his eyes had never happened. But now he needed time to come to his senses, and the guy, as he was sitting, began to look at everything in front of him. The first thing he thought about was whether he had really returned, and, carefully looking at the first thing that caught his eye, which were his hands, he was surprised why they were so small, and he also wanted to understand at what time he returned. But the young man abruptly pushed all his questions aside for later and decided to first find out how this man dared to grab him by the hair like that. The tyrant, not understanding what was happening, asked the young man what he meant and said whether this kid had gone crazy. The guy sharply but confidently grabbed the scoundrel by the hand, freeing his hair, and his whole body glowed with a purple train. The young man, getting up from his knees, told the tyrant that, to be precise, he had not gone crazy. And finally, rising to his full height, the boy held the huge man's hand above his head with his small hand and ended with the word that he had returned. The Hulk didn't show it, but thoughts flashed through his head about how this little kid who was unconscious was able to free himself from his grip and was also holding his hand so he couldn't move. The guy, sparkling with his amethyst eyes, asked the tyrant who he was to do this and, without making much effort, squeezed his huge hand so that it began to shake and added that the bastard was just an empty place. This time the big man got nervous and drops of sweat crawled down his face, and he thought to himself how powerful the boy was. The tyrant swore at the young man and raised his fist over him, shouting that he himself should hurry to the next world. The big man was a mountain compared to the boy, and now the tyrant's fist, cutting through the air, almost reached the guy. The hand, like a heavy hammer, came to the boy's head and he looked questioningly at the giant. The fist, just a drop short of reaching the head, was repelled by the guy's jump and the attack of his strength. The thug was in so much pain that he screamed furiously and his eyes rolled back. The tyrant could not help but scream because the boy had pierced his chest right through with his blow. The army stood looking at the fall and death of its leader, who fell at the feet of the boy, and behind him, on his knees, father and son watched everything. The men looked at their son and brother with their mouths open, but saw in him a completely different individual. The servants could not contain their emotions because they could not believe that the one who recently had power and dominance over everyone was now lying dead. But the clan also had its own strength, and instead of retreating, with a feeling of rage and a desire for revenge, with burning red eyes, they rushed towards the guy. The servants, like ghosts, flew at the boy, shouting to everyone not to let this boy live, but to kill him. These cries of death greatly surprised the guy, and he rolled up his sleeves with a smile and was already preparing for the attack. The forces clashed in a bright blow, as if two different fires were opposing each other. Bright purple stripes like blades cut enemies to shreds, leaving behind only splashes of blood. In front of the boy lay a huge mountain of corpses, and the ground was painted red. The ground was so drenched in blood that the guy noted to himself how strongly he could smell it. And I realized that this smell in this picture before my eyes looked exactly the same as on that day. He remembered his past incarnation, how he stood in the middle of a mountain of corpses and a sea of blood of those whom he trusted, but they betrayed him. The warrior remembered even more enemies who wanted his death, waiting for the moment to pounce on him. Warriors with swords, and their ringing sound of blades and the screams of rage of those attacking him surfaced in his memory. But suddenly, among all this darkness, one appeared whose movements were like the flapping of the wings of a butterfly. She cut through enemies with a sword as if it were part of her body, leaving behind a bright heavenly glow. The woman looked up where on the mountain of corpses stood the one next to whom she wanted to be now more than life. She stood below, wounded, and saw death approaching the warrior in the form of an enemy with a sword. And the warrior stood motionless, doing nothing, not moving and not speaking. The woman was shaking from powerlessness and held her hand on her body, where there was a large wound from which blood flowed. The warrior, continuing to scroll through his memories, realized that in the place where he stood, he too had to die. At least he hoped for death, and saw in front of him an enemy who was rushing at him with a sword. Accepting his fate, the warrior closed his eyes and froze in anticipation, and the sword was already at his head. But the air was pierced by a scream and the sound of a sword cutting human flesh, causing the warrior's eyes to open. The warrior watched as the sword fell from the enemy's hand, and a blade was sticking out of his chest, and blood was gushing out. The warrior remembered how, as a result, everything changed because of the woman he saw after the fall of the enemy. The warrior, unable to contain the pain and anger that he had to endure, shouted only one word, "Why?" The woman moved closer to the warrior, but no longer having any strength to stand on her feet, she began to fall. And while in the warrior's memory, the woman, exhausted and bleeding, was already on her knees in front of him, he realized that if she had not intervened, throwing away her life, then in this place, instead of a mountain of corpses, only his body would have been buried. The warrior on the fly grabbed the woman's shoulder with his hand, which was covered in blood as well as all their clothes. The warrior, holding the woman behind his back, silently looked at her just as she looked at him, and only the wind broke this grave silence by playing with the curls of their hair. The warrior recalled how he decided to ask again why the woman saved him because he was really curious. The woman looked at the warrior's face with eyes full of tears and replied that only now he looked at her. The warrior saw himself in the reflection of the woman's eyes, as he had never seen him anywhere else. The warrior looked at how heavily the woman was breathing and remembered that this individual was his sworn enemy. He sat on a mountain of corpses holding a woman in his arms and knew that the outcome of the duel with an old enemy had to be decided here. The woman was already very weak, but she still raised her trembling hand to the warrior. She touched his face and asked him not to cry, although streams were flowing from her eyes. The warrior looked at the woman in surprise and asked if he was crying. Large drops of tears rolled from the warrior's eyes, and he asked himself if he still had them. And the woman continued holding her hand on the man's face and said that he was not to blame for anything. The warrior was afraid from pain and hopelessness, and he did not find anything to answer the woman, but he felt her hand lowering. Breathing heavily, she told the warrior to think of it as a bad dream. The warrior realized that she had almost left him and furiously shouted so that the woman would not die. With her last breath, the woman turned to the warrior with the words that if the time spent with her was even a little worth it, even if it was a nightmare, then let him find her again. And she was already flying into her other incarnation of a girl who lived in a castle among the Rocky Mountains. And now, 5 years later, the story continues in the desert through which, at that time, a wanderer was walking with his camel. The man was wrapped from head to toe in cloth, and the camel walked behind him, laden like a mule. The camel stopped because he heard some approaching sounds. Out of nowhere, a man also wrapped in cloth jumped on top of the camel. And just as abruptly this man appeared, just as abruptly he disappeared from the back of the animal. The camel tried to tell his owner about the unknown person by shaking his head, but the owner did not understand what the animal wanted to tell him. Meanwhile, an unknown person moved further along the sandy mounds with lightning speed. Deftly covering a long distance with jumps, the traveler seemed to be playing with the wind in a race. And so he finally landed softly and silently, and from under the mask on his face, amethyst eyes shone. The warrior took off his mask and looked with a smile in the direction where he had arrived. He looked at the city in a green valley from a bird's-eye view and thought to himself that he would soon become a general. The sign of the huge house said that it was a martial arts school, but even without the inscription, the appearance of the building was quite strict and restrained, and one would have thought something similar. At the entrance to the castle, there was a huge slab with an image of a dragon in sacred scripture, and the school itself was created to educate novice masters. The students in the classes performed the technique so perfectly and harmoniously that one might think that they were cloned, and it is not for nothing that for a very long time talented children from all walks of life have been gathered here and studied with the best from Murim. Among the best of Murim are the famous old schools, where the direct descendants of the 5 dynasties, as well as the children of the highest families, study. In the background of the Dongcheon residence, there were mountains and dense forests, and in front of the residence a flag fluttered in the wind. In the residence, men sat at the table and thought to themselves about rumors that said that a teacher would arrive at the martial arts school. But here was a completely different person. The men continued to think about whether this man was from Gimcheon or perhaps from Sinchon, and they were very worried about the question of why this man was even here. The men sat at the table, and while drinking tea, looked at the back of the one who was standing at the window, and thought that someone of such a high level had come here and was personally waiting. The fighters were very interested in who this new master was, and if thoughts could be heard, they would say it all in one voice. The man stood and looked into the distance, and then broke the silence and said that the one he was waiting for was late. This strict master's name was Ma Kil-seong, and he was one of the elders of Gangho, who was always considered the strongest master among the 10 great ones from Gangho. Although Ma Kil-seong was an open-minded elder and a prominent member of the Murim Alliance, he was rarely encountered due to his strong passion for travel. The wait for the master and his contemplation of the roofs of the school were disrupted by the address to him as Ma Deyop. The head of Dongcheon, Jun Hyun, turned to the master trying to find out the reason why he personally came here, but the master interrupted him. Ma Kil-sun asked if it was really so strange that he, as a master, decided to drop by the martial arts school. Head Zhong timidly replied that he was simply surprised that the master personally came all the way here because of the new teacher. The head asked the master whether the new teacher was really so talented, to which he received the answer that it was unlikely, and asked his next question that the teacher could come from the 5 great dynasties, or was he a student of the great master, to which he again received a negative answer. The master told the head that he could not go into details and asked for forgiveness. The head smiled and said that nothing could be done, but he thought to himself that since the master was higher in rank, he couldn't question him anymore. Behind the doors, confident and loud steps were heard of the one whom everyone had been waiting for so much. The doors opened, and the student entered the room with a smile on his face, greeting everyone present loudly and cheerfully. The master was horrified, most likely knowing who it was, and the head had the same silent question on his face, but without surprise. The fighters turned their attention to the appearance of the so-called teacher, but there was no reaction. The servants announced the arrival of a new mentor, Cho Un, who had the mark of the House of Brass on his back. With his hands folded in a gesture familiar to students and masters, the teacher announced that from today, he was assigned to Dongcheon. The teacher continued to stand in front of everyone with a smile and folded hands in a gesture of greeting and respect and said, "I ask you to love and favor." Hejong looked at the new teacher, and thoughts swirled in his head about why this man was making him shiver. The head noticed for himself that the teacher's arms and legs looked thin, but he looked quite neat. The head also noticed, among other things, that the teacher's hair was combed back and tied in a ponytail. But despite the neatness of the teacher, Head Jong was still embarrassed by the length and pomp of the young man's bangs, which also got in the way of his face. But the head immediately stopped himself in the bud by saying that these were all the teacher's personal preferences. Now Head Jong began aloud to bombard the teacher with questions about whether he was really 25, and indicated that the young man looked quite young, to which Cho Un said that he looked so young because of the childish face that had been passed down in his family from generation to generation. The teacher liked to joke, judging by the fact that he said that he was a respectable man, so there was nothing strange even if he suddenly decided to get married. The head hesitated a little after hearing this, but agreed and then asked how the teacher received permission to get here, to which he replied about receiving permission from Chungamun. Head Jong lowered his gaze as if he was scrolling through pictures in his head and repeating, Chungamun said that he had never heard such a thing before. Cho Un smiled sincerely, answering that this small rundown village is not particularly famous for anything. Head Jong was shocked, to put it mildly, because usually when they talk about a letter of recommendation, they proudly stand out with their connections, and no matter how modest the school is, everyone tries to find something to brag about. Jong told Cho Un that he still saw that he had become a first-class master, but the teacher interrupted him and said that this was not so, and that it was because he was good in himself. The head looked carefully at the guy and felt that something was clearly wrong with him. Jong dropped this conversation, saying that he understood, but still concluded for himself that the guy was really very strange. The head asked Teacher Yom to show Cho Un his room and tell him how everything works here, to which Yom replied in the affirmative. Jong also turned to the new teacher with a request to take his things and follow Mentor Yom, and Cho Un, looking at Yom, thought that he looked like a poisonous toad. In a tall building on the 5th floor, steps could be heard, and the voice of a mentor addressed to the teacher that the new one would live here. Mentor Yom pointed his finger to the side and said that the new guy's room was the last one at the end of the 5th floor, and Cho Un silently accepted this. Cho Un simply looked at the mentor, but he bared his mouth through his teeth and asked if the guy had any complaints. The new teacher absolutely calmly answered the mentor that he had no complaints. Cho Un inquired that since Dongcheon is quite spacious, is it enough for him to know where only the dormitory and the training ground are located? To which Yom also overly and through gritted teeth replied that the guy would find out the rest on his own over time. The new guy turned around and walked towards his room, thinking that he had nothing to say to all this, and he didn't understand why Yumu didn't like him so much. And behind his back, the mentor spat to the side, showing his disrespect. Cho Un stood at the window and Yom asked him if he introduced himself as Un Hui, to which the new guy replied with his full name, Cho Un Hui, correcting the mentor, and he, as if provoking Cho Un, distorted his statement and disdainfully replied that it makes no difference what you call him. Yom asked Cho Un how he managed to get connections, meaning Master Ma, who was waiting for the teacher. Cho Un answered honestly and calmly that today he saw Master Ma for the first time. Yom made a displeased face and, pointing his finger at the guy, asked why the master came all the way here just to look at Cho Un. And by this he wanted to say that because of this visit they had to clean up early in the morning. The mentor said the last thing, that because of the visit, everyone was on nerves, so from now on Cho Un will have to be more careful and try not to stand out, after which he turned around and went to the exit. The new guy didn't understand why he should do this, but remained silent. The doors of the room were difficult to open and creaked, apparently because they were stagnant. Cho Un was able to open the door completely. Standing at the threshold, he already saw cobwebs in the corners of the room. The teacher realized that the room had not been cleaned on purpose when he saw the state of the bed, the floor, and the walls, and it was all covered in dust and dirt, and there was a bunch of cobwebs hanging on top. The newcomer concluded that not only did the room not smell like cleaning, but that it was completely abandoned. Cho Un put his things on the table, causing dust to rise in small clouds. Cho Un opened the window, and a huge amount of dust flew from it, as if the room had not been ventilated for 100 years. The guy realized that Yom seemed to have given him the top floor on purpose so that it would be difficult to walk back and forth. But this did not upset Cho Un, because the view from the window was amazing. Cho Un caught himself thinking that he would like to look around here some more, but then he prioritized cleaning his room. The guy raised his hand in front of him, and barely noticeable streams of wind came from it. But Cho Un raised his hand even higher, and as if increasing the energy of the wind, began to spin the funnel. The teacher competently managed his power, neither reducing it nor increasing it more than necessary. With light movements of his hand, he moved the wind, directing it as needed to clear the room. When all the dust and cobwebs were picked up by the wind, Cho Un directed him to the open window. And so much garbage poured out through the window as if it was not a room but a dirty street. Of all the windows in the house, only one was open, and from it a cloud of dust rose up towards the sky and the sun. Everything in the room sparkled as if after a spring cleaning, so the teacher was pleased with the work done. The evening rays enveloped the building in which Cho Un was staying, changing the color of the walls to a completely different color than it was in the morning. The guy left the window open and had already settled in the room, hanging up his outerwear and sat down at the table to open the box. The small box contained a sharp throwing blade and 2 bags, blue and burgundy. Cho Un picked up the blue bag and took out a ball very similar to a pearl, only golden in color, which was called the Heavenly Elixir. The Heavenly Elixir pill was needed so that if a warrior with chi eats them, he can restore his chi, but if an ordinary person eats the pill, he will live a long and happy life. And in the burgundy bag, clearly representing blood, lay 7 precious pills of the legendary deadly poison that will kill as soon as it is eaten, and the poisoned person will not be able to take even 7 steps. Having wrapped his wealth in a cloak, the guy was wildly happy that the most important thing was next to him. Cho Un fell on the bed with the thought that he could finally rest. The guy lay and looked at the ceiling, meanwhile thinking that 5 years had passed since he returned to life, and there was still a long way ahead, but he had already taken an important step. The teacher was so pleased and peaceful that he couldn't believe for a second whether everything was really as he thought. For the first time in a long time, Cho Un was able to fall asleep peacefully, plunging into the arms of sleep. And the dream was sweet compared to other dreams over the last 100 years of Cho Un Hui's existence. The guy had a dream where he fought with a huge snake that personified those who believed in the words of the traitor and hit him in the back, because of which even more enemies came out against him if that woman had not stopped them at the cost of her life. Cho Un saw the woman in his dream as clearly as when she died in his arms, and he heard her words that it was just a bad dream and that he would find her again at the end of this nightmare. The guy saw in a dream how he was holding a woman in his arms, shouting her name Manhwa Hui, and telling her how she dared to leave him. Cho Un screamed and woke up from his sleep, trying to catch his breath after all the memories. The teacher thought that he had definitely heard something crack, but could not understand what. But after carefully examining everything around, he saw how his leg got stuck in the wall, breaking it. Cho Un sat on the bed and carefully looked at the consequences of his dream, trying to come to his senses. The guy pulled out his leg and was already reproaching himself for what he had done just arriving at the exercise. Cho Un, looking at the hole in the wall, tried to reassure himself that there was nothing terrible, but something needed to be done about it. The guy, out of curiosity, decided to look into the hole since it appeared. Cho Un saw a pretty girl there who at first didn't quite understand why the wall broke. But when the girl saw the eye that was watching her through the broken wall, she felt uneasy. The guy realized that he had terribly embarrassed the girl, which made him also embarrassed, and began to say all sorts of polite nonsense like how nice the morning and weather were today. A bundle of bandages fell from the girl's hands to the floor and she ran out of the room. The girl's scream was so loud that she could be heard and on the street, causing the birds to fly into the sky. From the house where the teacher met everyone, the screams of the enraged head Zhong were heard that the new guy managed to break through the wall on the very first day. Cho Un was burning with shame and, at least jokingly, tried to justify himself by saying that the walls were flimsy and the builders had generally done a poor job. The head jumped up from the table, slamming his hands on it, and shouted to the new guy to be silent. Zhong, continuing to stand, began to draw something with a brush on a sheet of paper. Cho Un noticed that the head was writing something and worriedly asked what exactly. The head replied to the teacher that on paper, the amount that Cho would have to reimburse. Cho Un could not contain his surprise and voiced his indignation that a tree that seemed rotten was worth 30 silver and asked the head if it was really gilded. The head was so furious at Cho Un's ignorance that he had broken not just a piece of wood, but a hop hornbeam, that is, a Japanese tree of the birch family, which is called iron because of its strong trunk and grows in Nanman. Zhong threatened the new guy that if he had his way, he would have forced him to pay all the repair costs. But since this was the first mistake, he said to pay at least for the material, And Cho Un stood and was still digesting the information that, firstly, he was able to break the iron tree, and secondly, he broke an expensive tree. The guy sighed heavily because no matter how he was in a difficult situation. The newcomer headed towards the exit, but the same girl who ran away was walking towards him, and now she turned to the teacher apologizing and said that it was most likely because she made noise. It was clear from the girl that she was uncomfortable with what happened and was worried. Cho Un at that moment was thinking that he had broken the wall and was guilty, and the girl was apologizing to him, and it seemed strange to him. Cho Un made a serious face and asked the girl if she really thought that just an apology was enough, to which the poor girl became even more worried and offered her help in the form of splitting the payment between two. The guy realized that the girl took his joke completely seriously, immediately explained his humor to her, and said that since it was initially his fault, he would pay, which made the girl cheerful. Cho Un looked at the girl and thought that she was most likely worried that he would force her to pay because the mentors in Dongcheon still had a small salary. The teacher continued to look at the girl and found her very cute. Cho Un asked if there was a division between men and women here and whether they really used the same building to spend the night, to which the girl replied that this is only the case in Dongcheon. The girl kindly explained that in Incheon, there are divisions between bedrooms on each floor, but in Gimcheon, everything is different due to the size of the building. But in Sincheon, she heard that the teachers each live in a separate annex. Cho Un changed his face to himself, saying what kind of world this is, in which money is everything. And the girl, noticing the changes in the guy's face, asked what he said. The teacher brought the girl's question back from her thoughts to the real world, and he said that he didn't even introduce himself, brought his hands together in a gesture of greeting, and said the full name of Cho Un Hui. The girl was glad to meet you and also, folding her hands to show her respect, called herself Yomei Hong and expressed her hope that they would get along. At that moment, other mentors came in, and Yom turned to Mentor Yo and sarcastically said that getting along with the new guy was the best idea. Yom said sarcastically that the new guy is the one who is trying to attract attention by making unnecessary noise. Cho Un repeated that they just have flimsy walls, to which Yom asked the guy if he really just called the iron tree frail, adding to this whether the new guy is too bragging. Yom told Mentor Ye to leave this guy and suggested that everyone go have a snack together. Yomei said that everything was fine and she didn't need it, and Yom, seeing the change in the girl's face, asked not to be too strict on her, arguing that they were close. Mentor Yo repeated that everything was fine, to which Yom agreed and added that she knew that he was not the one who would force anyone to do anything. Yom shouted that in this case, everyone is going to have a drink together, to which the other mentors asked if he would pay for the drink, and now it's clear why he looked excited since the morning. Cho Un asked Yomei if it was normal that the mentors were going to drink at such a time, to which the girl explained that they have fun like that only sometimes because the students in Dongcheon are not particularly keen on martial arts, so they slack off during group training. The girl continued that, instead of learning from mentors with enthusiasm, they simply use only the fighting skills learned in the family, and therefore most invite external masters and learn from them, and the girl herself also often takes private lessons. Cho Un asked a completely logical question. Why then try to enroll here at all? And the girl explained that there is no better place than here to make connections. The guy said in disappointment that he didn't expect that Kang Ho's cradle was rotten through and through, and the girl said that this was especially true for Dong Cheon. Cho Un decided to lighten up their conversation and concluded that you need to have a good time to understand this place, and invited Yo Mei to talk over food. Mentor Yo said that it was great, but explained that although the food here is free, it tastes like nothing. Cho Un reassured the girl and said that he would buy his mentor something tasty in the dining room. Yo Mei was surprised and explained that the food here is free, because it's not called food here for nothing. The guy didn't seem to hear Yo Mei and joyfully walked towards the dining room, repeating that he would buy food and called her to come with him. Yo Mei was even more surprised because most of the teachers in Dongcheon are arrogant. Mentally, the girl remembered the behavior of the other mentors and already knew that among them it is customary to exaggerate their achievements, which in fact are not there, and they brag to show their superiority. And now she looked at the new mentor and realized that on the other hand, he seemed to be different from the others. Yomei covered her smile from the thought that this new mentor seemed like a pleasant person to her. The mentor followed the guy and thought that thanks to the guy, the impenetrable life in Dongcheon would become a little more fun. The girl quickened her pace and called Cho to wait for her because the guy had almost entered the dining room. A blush appeared on Yomei's cheeks from the fact that life really began to sparkle with different colors. Mentor Cho realized that he had become very close to Mei after that incident with the broken wall. The more the guy got to know the mentor, the more convinced he was that she was very capable and strong, and she also told a lot about the school and showed everything. Yomei explained that Dongcheon has a total of 12 pavilions and 30 rooms, and in the back there is a training ground for mentors. And in the very central part, there is a large training ground where they conduct group training twice a week. Mentor Cho sat down on the bench and tiredly asked if Mentor Yomei didn't say that Dongcheon is the smallest of the schools, to which the girl smiled and said that their school is the smallest. Cho Un asked in an exhausted voice if they really call it small because they spent half a day just to inspect everything here. Mentor Cho recalled that he managed to see only 5 huge pavilions and several smaller ones, and as if reading Yomei's thoughts, she said that the Incheon residence was twice as large, and Gimcheon was 3 times larger, and tired of just the words, Cho asked why make them so big. Teacher Yomei explained that most people study martial arts here, but this is only a small part of what the school can provide. And the girl gave examples that here you can learn such art as poetry, drawing, or calligraphy, and even study military strategy. And there are also several places to drink tea and countless training grounds. While the mentor was saying that it's not for nothing that such establishments are called the cradle of the political faction, Cho thought that if he sold a few tiles, he could increase his monthly salary. Yomei asked if Cho knew any of his students, to which, out of misunderstanding, the guy asked again, repeating the same question with one of the students. The teacher was shocked that 10 days after Cho, he was not assigned students, and the guy was dissatisfied with the fact that in addition to carrying out the orders of the nasty teachers, he also needed to take care of the students. Cho remembered that same nasty toad in the form of Mentor Yom and thought that he was working hard. The guy analyzed that the fact that Yom did not approve of him was obvious, given that he looked at the guy angrily every time Cho just appeared in his field of vision. And Cho jokingly thought to himself that he would soon have a hole in the back of his head. Mentor Yomei asked what Cho had been doing all this time, and the guy replied that he was cleaning the training ground or watering the orchids in the backyard and sometimes fixing broken mannequins. Yomei was both angry and upset at the same time because this is the job of juniors in rank, and they are mentors and their job is to instruct and teach martial arts. The girl came to her senses and asked Cho for forgiveness, saying that she didn't want to be angry with him. Cho said that everything was fine, but thought to himself that the mentor seemed to be able to get angry too. The guy still wondered why none of the students were assigned to him, but at the same moment he realized that he would have more work if the students appeared. This issue was resolved on its own because Cho learned from Yomei that every month competitions are held between mentors and their students. Mentor Yo said that such competitions for the achievements of teachers are the best way to test how well a mentor teaches martial arts. And this is also an opportunity to find young masters among students. Cho Un thought about Yomei's words, that if you compete every month, then the mentors will not neglect their responsibilities, and the students will keep themselves in shape, and this is quite effective. But the guy returned to the same problem with which he started, that he now has no opportunity to teach anyone martial arts because he has no students. Silence fell between the interlocutors, but Cho Un continued to look at Yomei, which made the situation awkward, and the mentor became embarrassed, thinking about why he was looking at her like that. Cho Un immediately went to the main building of Dongcheon where Chief Zhang usually stayed. Mentor Cho sharply opened the doors, and Yomei could barely keep up with him, and turning to the head of Zhang, he asked how this happened. In front of the head's table stood that same nasty toad in the form of Yom, already grinning at what was happening. And when head Zhang asked what had already happened, Cho asked why none of the students were assigned to him. Judging by the reaction on Jun's face, he really didn't understand what Mentor Cho meant, and Yom thought to himself how quickly this guy noticed it. Mentor Yom, pretending to be a fool, began to bleat that in fact, he was going to assign students to the new guy, but the problem was that no one liked the mentor. Mentor Cho directly asked a completely logical question that they didn't like him, whom the students had never even met. Further, pretending to be innocent, Yom said that thinking about Mentor Cho, he selected several good talents. But the problem turned out to be just as fictitious as the rest of Yom's words, and it was that most of the students stated that studying with an unnamed mentor would hurt their pride, to which head Zhang said that, be that as it may, shouldn't the guy be given a chance to prove himself? Swan Yom bowed and said that this was his mistake, and he would immediately take measures to correct the situation. Chief Yung approached Yom and said that since he took over as the head of Dongcheon, he has been losing his precious hair due to such daily troubles and asked his mentor not to let him go bald ahead of time. Mentor Yom realized that the matter was really serious, and the demand for his antics would be dear to him, so he replied that he understood everything and asked the head not to worry. Mentor Yom and Cho were left alone, and while on the street, the toad said displeasedly that the new guy wanted Yom to take care of him too, and added that he really couldn't sit quietly, or had he decided to kill him completely. Mentor Cho remained silent, but turned his head and looked around and realized that there was no one nearby, which means there were no witnesses. The new guy's fist clenched, and he thought that since no one was there, he might as well try this nasty, poisonous toad just once. But Cho stopped Yom from throwing the notebook in his direction, which the guy managed by deftly grabbing it, and heard from Yom that the new guy was now responsible for these students. Cho flipped through a notebook with many sheets of paper and asked Yom if he was answering for everyone, to which the toad disrespectfully spat to the side and replied that there were only 20 people, and added that it was Cho's direct responsibility as a mentor to take care of each of them. Yom was jubilant at having delegated such a difficult job to a new person, and sarcastically thought that it would be seen whether Cho could cope with the task. Meanwhile, there were already about 20 days left before the competition, and Mentor Cho was actively visiting students from the list and was now just looking for Kusohep, which means addressing a fighter of junior rank. Mentor Cho pulled back the screen and found the student in the room, and he began to make excuses by saying that he was absent because something happened. Mentor Cho didn't even have time to insert a word before the student replied that he did not need the teachings of a newcomer and was going to learn from Master Chan and Yang. Another student answered indifferently that he was studying forensic science and in general was not interested in group training from someone who was not even a martial arts master. And the student objected that she was not going to study from someone who came from God knows where. Mentor Cho went outside to sit and catch his breath because he didn't understand what was going on, and the situation began to piss him off. The guy analyzed that all the students he visited last night sharply refused him, and it was not just a lack of motivation, because as soon as he spoke to them, they immediately avoided him as if they saw something unpleasant. At a moment of reflection, Yomei approached Cho and asked if the mentor had met with the students entrusted to him, to which the puzzled Cho turned to the mentor, looking at her carefully, and asked if he really smelled bad, to which he saw surprise on the girl's face. Mentor Cho explained to Yomei the problem he encountered yesterday and expressed his misunderstanding of the situation. Yomei thought about it and gave Cho the puzzle that was missing, saying that this behavior of the students was due to the fact that rumors were spreading, and this surprised the guy, but he asked what kind of rumors. Mentor Yo explained that the rumors first circulated among the mentors and now seem to have reached the students. Yomei told some of the rumors that Cho doesn't know how to do anything and got here because of connections and paid a lot of money to be accepted. But Yomei immediately said that she dismissed it as rumors, and the guy, in turn, thought that it was strange. That doesn't sound so bad. And to everything else, the girl added that there are rumors that Mentor Cho is beating around the bush trying to lure men, from which the guy was shocked and shouted if they were really trying to stop him from getting married, and Yomei asked if this matters now. Cho Un changed his face, becoming angry, but answered not to the girl, but to himself and his thoughts that this is very important, because the reason why he came to the martial arts school in the first place was to meet her. Out loud, the guy asked only one question. What is the point of doing this to him? To which Yomei put forward her assumptions that Teacher Yom is in this way trying to oust those who have exceptional abilities or those he does not like. Crackling his fists, Cho said that since this had already been done, it seemed that there was no way out, and he was now thinking whether he should act in the same dirty way, to which Yomei replied that it was not worth it and added that although Yom has a bad character, he is talented and outstanding master. The guy smiled, thinking that even if that toad was a master 10 times over, he was far from him. Yomei's mentor said that she had a person who could help Cho solve his problem, and the guy was embarrassed and happy at the same time because the girl was trying to help him and thought that it was great to finally meet someone. And while Cho was wondering who this person was who would help him, they came to Yomei's sister, and the guy noticed that she had a uniform for Inchin mentors and did not understand why people from one school would help people from another school in their work. The sister made Yomei blush because she said out loud that the guy is a little different from what she heard and doesn't know about his character, but he has a cute appearance. The sister from Inchin saw Yomei's reaction and, placing her finger on her sister's plump and pink cheeks, said that she was joking. Afterwards, the girl introduced herself as Mo Yon-sun, a teacher at the Inchin school. The guy also introduced himself as Cho Un, the mentor of the Dongcheon school, and in addition to everything, in his humorous manner, he said that he was 25 years old, which is the ideal marriageable age for a warrior. Mo laughed and said that, as expected, The guy was a really funny person, which was in line with the words of her sister May. May put her hand on her sister's shoulder and said that she and Song studied at the same martial arts school. And Mo added that she didn't even think that she would become a mentor in such a boring place. They were served food and Cho asked if Yom had always been the way he is now, to which Mo replied that he was, and he was famous when the sisters were in school. The baozi looked delicious, and Mo took the first one, continuing to say that everyone who knows about the background of the rumors knows what kind of person he really is. Mo explained to Cho that Teacher Yom is in good standing here, provided that if you constantly pay him a monetary contribution and do not cross the line, then he will have no reason to kick out the new one. Mentor Cho asked Mo about his suspicions that because of Yom, he was about to be thrown out of here and asked what he should do in that case, to which Mo replied that it would not be easy. But Mo still suggested that it would be best to attract a good student to her side and achieve noticeable success in competitions. And then Mo warned that no one had ever managed to do something like this before. But if Cho succeeded, he would be able to make an unusual impression on other students. Yomei understood what Mo meant and wanted to ask if she really meant what she thought. But May interrupted Cho and said that this was the only way out, and May tried to talk about that man with horror in her voice, but Mo did it for her sister. Mo named Namgung student Yun Ho and designated him as a disgrace to the great Namgung family and the ghost of Dong Cheon. Cho immediately began to analyze in his head that if he bears the surname Namgung, this means that he is a descendant of one of the great families, and why then would someone from the Namgung family enroll in Dongcheon? Cho introduced this student and wanted to know why he is a disgrace to the family and also the ghost of Dongcheon. Mo, with a slight movement of her hand, threw one of the chopsticks onto the table, addressing Cho by his rank as Sohep. And while the wand was sticking out from behind the table, stuck into it and swaying like a pendulum, Mo asked Cho if he wanted to hear one legend. The wand caused cracks to spread across the table, but the guy didn't pay any attention to it and only asked Mo about the legend, showing his sincere interest. In one of Dongcheon's rooms, Yom was having a conversation with one of the students and asked how things were going with the under-mentor Cho, to which the student replied that he cursed him to his face and he left very depressed. Yom asked what happened after, to which the student replied that he heard Cho go to see several other students. And the guy, being pleased with the fact that he worked as an informer, said that everyone closed the doors in front of Cho like everyone else and said to do Yom. This poisonous toad was satisfied and decided to encourage the student that it was time for him to get a promotion too. So he would assign a suitable mentor to the guy for these competitions so that he should show his skills properly. And Yom thought to himself that he wouldn't allow this new guy to stay here, so it's good to take care of it. Yom felt superior to other mentors and students since he was appointed as a leader on behalf of Head Young, and his influence in Dongcheon became absolute. This toad has used all sorts of methods to gain power, and the method he is now using is called repression. Yom recruits obedient students and manipulates public opinion among them, also forcing them into group actions against teachers he doesn't like in order to kick them out of school. When the goal is achieved, Yom manipulates the results of the competition to promote the people he needs. Be that as it may, holding competitions was within the competence of teacher Yuma, so there were no problems with rigging the results, and students of low and medium ranks whose skills were at stake were obsessed with moving up the career ladder. Well, after the students received this promotion in their careers, they kept silence about what happened, and Yom believed that Kanho is not only martial arts. Yom knew that all sorts of tricks were common here, and that some were not even shy about plotting intrigues against others, while he was just letting arrogant mentors know the bitterness of life, and he was sure that this was the mission of every teacher. Yum was distracted from his conversation with himself by a student who wanted to add something else, which greatly surprised the teacher that the guy was still here. The student put his hand into his shirt to take out something with words about his family, who wanted to thank the mentor as a school teacher. The guy took out a bag of coins and said that this was the teacher's troubles, something like a small compensation for the fact that Yom took care of the student's promotion. Yuma was delighted to see money from what he was doing, and continuing to flatter and dissemble, he told the student that he was very proud of him. Throwing the jingling bag in his hand, Yom said that since the student shows such sincerity, there is no reason why he cannot help. Yom promised that this time the student would definitely advance in his career, which made the guy very happy, and after bowing, he thanked the teacher. Mentor Cho was haunted by thoughts about the ghost of Dong Cheon, and sitting on a bench in the garden in the evening, he studied the information. It was written in the notebook that the Namgung family is the first-ranking family among the 5 great families, whose power is beyond the reach of the influential forces of the 9 great ones from Kanho. The heir of the family is praised and called the best among the past chapters. And in the text, Cho got to Namgung's younger brother, Yong-ho, who was also called the small dragon of the sword. It was also indicated in the scriptures that the outstanding talents who lead the future of the Kanho faction are called the 5 dragons and the 3 phoenixes. And Namgung Yong-ho was the most famous genius among the dragons, but Namgung Yun-ho was the worst of the worst. Namgung Yun-ho is 21 years old and has been living in Dongcheon for 7 years, while others stay in Dongcheon for no more than a year and at the latest 2. Cho thought that it would be interesting to hear about this and realized that if Yun-ho has been rotting here for 7 years, then the family has given up on him. And Cho also noticed that Yun-ho is not on the list of students. And what can we say about the meeting? In addition, Namgung Yong-ho was considered the young master of the great family, and those who were not familiar with the situation of how things were in Gangho did not even know about the existence of his brother Yun-ho. Cho continued to wonder, one of which was whether the eldest son of the family could disappear and hide from everyone like that. Cho also remembered from Mo's story that it was not a coincidence at all that she knew about Yun-ho, who was not even on the list of students in Dongcheon, and that at first he studied at the same time as Mo but then disappeared. That's why Namgung Yun-ho became something of a ghost, absent even from the documents. Cho continued to read the notes, realizing that no matter how you looked at it, it was all very strange. It's strange because this man was supposed to be fluent with a sword, but he is considered just a ghost of the school. Mentor Cho became quite interested in this whole mysterious story, and he smiled because he wanted to solve it. Dongcheon, stern but lively, was bathed in the rays of the sun on this beautiful fine day. A long-haired fighter was walking around the school grounds, and to the side of him the voices of other students were heard talking among themselves. As soon as the fighter noticed the direction of the students in his direction, he rose upward like a spring. The guys, not noticing that there was literally someone just in front of them, continued to talk enthusiastically. The fighter, with his jump, ended up on the roof of the wall absolutely silently. When the fighter jumped from the tiles to the ground, Cho found him and said that he had done very well. Judging by the thick stubble on his face, the fighter had not been among people for quite a long time, as if he had gone wild and now did not expect that someone would take him by surprise like that. The fighter asked Cho who he was, and the guy replied that he was the new mentor in Dongcheon. The fighter indifferently turned around without answering Cho and went on about his business. Mentor Cho followed the fighter and said that he wanted to talk, to which the fighter replied that he had nothing to say. Cho insisted and said that the conversation would only take a couple of minutes, but the fighter still said that he was not interested. Cho caught up with the fighter and asked him to at least listen while touching him. Touching the fighter was a big mistake because he turned to Cho very angry. Cho removed his hand and absolutely did not expect such a reaction from this man, but did not say anything. Yun-ho asked if Cho was also going to sell him some rare medicine. Cho did not understand at all what medicine we were talking about, and his face also showed misunderstanding. And Yun-ho asked maybe Cho wanted to say that he would train him in a special way and Yun could even become a master. And without waiting for an answer, he said that before Cho, there were more than 10 mentors offering rare elixirs and those who tried to teach ridiculous tricks under the guise of special practices. And in addition, Yun told the story that there was someone who introduced him to the shaman, and he said that he was cursed, and Cho stood and listened silently, to which Yun finished and asked what the mentor would do. Yun understood and said that Cho wanted to become famous by asking to be his mentor, and if he showed his favor to the shame of the Namgung family, he could boast of a good heroic story. Again, without waiting for Cho's answer, Ghost Yun added that he had no more money for quack medicines and there was not even hope left. When Yun left, he told Cho to follow his request to try to create a hero story for self-soothing with someone else and not disturb people with his curiosity. Cho did not catch up or call Yun this time, but simply remained standing in place, silently watching the ghost go. Cho concluded that this guy himself said that he had nothing to talk about with me, but he didn't even let me get a word in. A blanket of night and silence hung over Dongcheon, but somewhere under the trees the movements of a sword could be heard. These sounds of cutting the wind came from Yun-ho, who was attempting to train. As always, fencing disappointed him, and no matter how much Yun-ho tried to awaken his internal energy, he could not control it properly. But not to control it to such an extent that you stop feeling the energy. But at some point his stomach, in which he strongly felt the energy, began to go numb and sensitivity disappeared. Yun-ho was told that this could be a rare disease and he desperately tried to get some medicine, but in the end, Nothing helped him. Still, Namgung Yunho could not lower his sword, so he continued his training desperately. Yunho thought that if he stopped training, he would forget the technique of wielding a sword, which is why he swung it so furiously. Yunho was still disappointed with his swordsmanship and clung to his training as hope. The fighter stubbornly continued to train, not without sometimes exhausting himself. If it weren't for all the rumors that were circulating about Yunho, he performed the technique perfectly, but his lack of faith in his own skills made itself felt. Yunho felt that he was tired and stopped, but it was clear from him that he was tired not only physically. The fighter drank plenty of water from the flask after such an active training. Yunho wiped his mouth with his hand, removing the remaining water from the thick stubble of his face. And then Yun sat down on a bench to rest and think about what happened today. Yun remembered the meeting with the new mentor and concluded from his appearance that he looked younger than him. Yun grabbed his head from the fact that everyone was ahead of him and wondered why only he stood still. Yun looked at his training tool standing next to him and thought that he was pathetic. The fighter looked further at his training weapon and realized that this was truly a pitiful sight. Yunho took up the wooden sword and prepared to leave, and somewhere nearby you could barely hear the words, "I'm so sorry." The fighter headed towards the exit from the field with his head down, once again disappointed in himself. The shop, like a good old friend, was left alone to wait for the next guest to support him both morally and physically. A purple glow appeared near the shop like a ghost or a teleport. As it turned out, Mentor Cho was nearby all this time and saw Yun's training and heard how he was suffering from the problem. Mentor Cho, analyzing everything he heard, thought that Yunho was saying strange things. Cho followed Yun with his eyes to the gate and realized the obvious that it was the same ghost. Mentor Cho wondered why the fighter couldn't just show this level now. This was an unanswered question, but one thing was clear for sure. Yun does not give up, even if he is disappointed by the countless number of attempts, which means he needs to push him somehow. After all, how many talented people in the world have given up in the face of disappointment? The only thing that makes Cho happy is that Yun is still holding on no matter what. Cho realized that he needed to find a way that could influence Yun the most, because it is rare to see a talented person who moves straight forward and does not retreat even if there is darkness around him. But one thing became clear to Cho, and not because he knows the future and not because he needs it. Cho continued to look after Yun as he left and realized that it had to be him. Cho realized that his main mission would be to gain the attention and trust of this guy. Cho, smiling widely, made this decision for himself because he likes idiots like Namgung. From the house illuminated by lanterns in the evening, a dialogue between two men could be heard. One of the men in light clothes, walking from side to side, asked Master Ma if he had met Cho Un, to which the master answered in the affirmative. And then the next question was asked what Master Ma could say about the young man. Master Ma replied that he did not see anything special in the guy, and it seemed to him that the young man had not even mastered the demonic martial art. The man in a white robe was the head of the Zhongquanchu Martial Arts School, and his name was Song and Hyuk, and she asked Master Ma if the master had such suspicions about the new guy. Master Ma argued that he doubted Cho Un's abilities more than that he could use demonic martial art, because he saw his hands that did not have a hint of calluses from training. Master Ma also added that there were not only no calluses on the young man's hands, but even no scratches, and the head of Song replied that this was not a very common occurrence, but this could also happen. Head Sun expressed on this matter that he would not like to admit, but there are warriors in the world, and they, like weeds, spend their lives in real battles. But there are also those who continue to remain on the training ground like a hothouse plant. Head Song thought that Cho Un was a rather ordinary guy, but the elder himself came and even asked me for a request, so the head wondered what kind of person the guy could be. Head Sun ran out to meet the elder, surprised that he had come personally, and Sun was ashamed that the master had to wait so long. The elder sat at the table drinking tea and told Sun that he heard how he was appointed head of the Zhongquanchu Martial Arts School this time and congratulated him on his promotion. Head Song was embarrassed and half-heartedly thanked him, but then asked why the elder decided to go such a long way to him. It was clear from the old man's dirty and tired hands that the road had indeed been long, and the elder took a sip of tea from a mug before answering. The elder replied that he had come to ask the head for a favor, and Sun clarified what kind of favor he was talking about. The elder voiced that he wanted Sun to place a mentor somewhere, that he was 25 years old and a first-class master. The elder looked quite seriously at the head of Sun and added that he would not even mind if this was the lowest position. And at the end, he added that he hoped that the request would be fulfilled. Head Song stood up from the table and offered to drink a glass and talk a little more because he had just recently received good alcohol. The elder followed the head with his eyes downcast, flying in his thoughts, and kept thinking about the same thing. The sage kept replaying his mentor's name in his thoughts over and over again, as if he was afraid to forget him, and it was Cho Un. The elder recalled that he used all his connections to find out something about him, at least where he lived or where he was from, or maybe something about his parents, but it was all in vain. The elder wondered to himself, this man could not appear like this out of nowhere. The elder decided to remember again how he and the guy met, and it all started on a fine day. Grandpa, having nothing to do out of boredom, decided to clean his obviously already dirty nose. And it was not in vain that I decided to check, because a dried lump of snot launched into the air from my finger. The elder yawned sweetly through all his remaining teeth in old age, as if he wanted to suck in all the air. The yawn was followed by stretching, since grandfather spent quite a long time sitting, but this did not stop him from noticing what a wonderful day it was. The old man decided to check his bowl and, in horror, grabbed the place on his chest where his heart was. The bowl was empty and only a leaf fell there, as if nature itself felt sorry for the grandfather and wanted to help. The elder, looking carefully at the bowl, thought that maybe he should go back. Immediately after these words, something heavy and bright fell into the bowl, because the elder's face glowed brighter than the sun. Grandpa, in shock, picked up a real gold bar and couldn't believe his eyes. Grandpa was even more surprised by who stood in front of him and threw this gold, and a tall, long-haired guy in clothes stained with blood addressed him. The guy again turned to Elder Chivigolka and asked if he was right in tying his long and thick hair at the same time. Elder Chivigolka watched the guy wield the ribbon in his hands, putting his hair in order, and still tried to come to his senses and asked himself the question of whether this was an ordinary young man in front of him. The young man said that he came because he heard that this particular grandfather was Elder Chivigolka, and he asked that, judging by the appearance of the young man, he should turn to a doctor and not pester a beggar. Elder Chivigolka, seeing that in front of him was an ordinary guy, decided to test with his tongue whether the gold was real. The guy stretched out a smile on his face and replied that there was nothing to worry about because the blood on his clothes was not his. The elder, at the same time suspicious and dissatisfied, thought that this young man could not tell that he was bluffing, and asked why the guy was looking for him. The guy smiled mysteriously and put his hand behind one part of his clothes, still looking at his grandfather. The young man said that he was going to turn to Elder Chivigolka with one request. Grandpa cleverly hid the gold in his clothes and said that if a guy is looking for a hitman, it's better for him to go to the black market. The guy got close enough to scare his grandfather and said that if he needs to kill someone, he doesn't have to resort to someone's help for this, because he is sure that he moves and acts faster than any mercenary. After the words were spoken, the guy clarified that he saw his grandfather hide the ingot, and the elder thought that the young man was also big-eyed. The old man was thinking about what to do, and realized that most likely he would not be able to leave the guy so easily. The elder had already prepared his hand in which his strength was glowing in order to carry out the escape plan. Grandpa suggested that maybe he could quickly attack the guy and escape. But if the elder had the strength of a raccoon, then the guy had the strength of a tiger, and the young man, noticing the old man's hand with his strength, was ready to attack too. The elder had an uneasy feeling because not only he but also the guy had energy. The old man became excited and drops of sweat flowed down his face, indicating that there would be no battle. The elder cast aside his disturbing thoughts, chalking it up to the fact that his joints had been hurting like this lately. Chivigolka reluctantly agreed with the guy and told him to explain what the request was. The young man, to celebrate, said that he wanted to create a new personality, that is, himself but someone else. The elder lazily said that for such a guy it was not necessary to look for him, to which the young man said that with an ordinary fake personality, it would be difficult to realize his plans. So the guy wants to get a job as a mentor at a martial arts school. The elder objected indignantly that the guy was really asking him to betray the Murim alliance, and added that the young man's request was so impudent that the elder was speechless. The young man was surprised and explained that this was not betrayal, and he just wanted the elder to get him a recommendation, and so that his origin would not be obvious. Namely, it would be better if the guy came from an existing clan and a neutral faction. The guy explained that the heavenly faction is too boring, and the evil faction is disgusting. In addition, the stranger asked that he be moderately good at martial arts because he did not want to look exceptional, but at the same time, so that he would not be ignored because of his skills. The young man quite clearly outlined the most important thing for him, which is why the grandfather was in a stupor, not knowing what else to expect from the guy. The guy insistently indicated that he must be 25 years old without fail and unconditionally. And since the guy repeated the word necessarily many times, the elder asked why he had to be exactly 25. The guy, knowing his whole plan, put his hand to his face and full of drama said that she was now 20, and since Grandpa didn't know what was in the young man's head, he didn't understand anything. And the young man, as if not noticing the presence of the old man, continued to explain in all colors that she was old-fashioned, and therefore the difference of 1 or 2 years would be too small, and even if he was 24, therefore it was too dangerous to take risks. The elder realized what was going on, and he said in surprise, but with understanding that the bride was quite picky. The guy fell apart with sadness and said that his goal was to hear her call him Big Brother, and that he would rather bite his tongue than allow himself to be called younger again. After all, the old man turned to the guy with the fact that he had one question, and the guy asked what it was. The elder inquired that the guy seemed to know his future wife well, so why should he create a new identity and increase his status and get to know her again? The guy answered quite seriously that the girl didn't know him yet, and the old man again asked if the young man really didn't know this woman. The guy looked carefully at the old man and put his hand under his clothes as if he wanted to get something out of there again. The bowl rattled and swayed from the weight after 2 gold bars fell into it. 2 gold bars were in excellent condition for the old man to not know anything else, and the guy repeated that the person he wants is 25 years old and a martial arts instructor. And while the elder was trying to wake up from the fact that he now had 3 gold bars, the guy was already leaving and finally said that the old man should try to do everything as quickly as possible and let him know how everything would be ready. Elder Chwigolka shouted to the guy to stop and asked what would happen if he just left with the bullion and did nothing. The guy didn't even turn around but confidently asked the old man if he really thought that this was a problem. The elder realized that the guy was not to be trifled with and asked what his name was, because he had to know the name in order to create a new identity for him. The young man was pleased with the work done and the fact that his plan of action was slowly being implemented. The hitherto mysterious young man turned around and said his full name, Cho Un, and added that he was a warrior of marriageable age. In the room, the conversation continued between the head of Song and Master Ma, and Song expressed his thoughts that the guy is still capable because the elder guaranteed it and he's not mistaken. Song also said that demonic martial arts are of course good, but since the guy still got a job as a mentor, teaching skills are more important. The head and master knew that among masters with outstanding abilities, in addition to developing skills, teaching is often considered a more difficult matter. The head made a comparison of his thoughts with lions in the wild, where there are lions who set an example for the younger generation, and there are those who lazily lie on a stone and just watch. Chapter Dream continued that in any case, if a guy encounters a difficult student, sooner or later his potential will be revealed and they will find out what is so special about him. Both masters understood which student they were talking about, and all they could do was wait. 5 years ago, on that same moonlit night, something happened in the Namgung family palace. Father and sons walked under the moonlight from one part of the palace to another. The father and his rather young son, Namgung Yunho, stopped because they noticed a bright light from the side. The radiance emanated from the old man and his sword, which trailed a trail of blue flame after every movement, and Yunho recognized him as his grandfather. It was not for nothing that Namgung Yunho's grandfather, who was called the Silk Tiger Sword Sin Gong, appeared that day. Sin Gong, having realized enlightenment, abandoned his ignorance and was able to reach the highest peak of his level in swordsmanship. Namgung Yunho accidentally witnessed the scene and could not take his eyes off the sword-fighting dance. The young man forever imprinted this moment in his memory, and it was he who began to guide him through life. As always, life was in full swing at Dongchun School, and the beautiful weather was pleasing to the eye. Yunho stood in the middle of the field with one hand on a wooden fighting instrument and silently looked ahead. The ghost's attention was caught by the good morning greeting from Cho Un, and he already grabbed the katana for protection. Cho Un stretched well and yawned sweetly, after which he asked Yun whether he slept well that night. Yunho looked at the guy indifferently, but he was surprised that Cho still did not give up. Namgung turned around and began to leave, but Cho, with a smile on his face, said after him that the fighter can leave if he wants, because it doesn't matter because the guy will come one way or another tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. Yunho stopped but remained silent, and Cho continued to speak as if provoking that the fighter really thinks that if not here, then he can hide from him somewhere else and train. Cho's plan worked and Yun reacted to his mentor's words, but Namgung was really angry. Although the ghost was unaccustomed to people, he did not lose his boundaries and asked the mentor why he was doing this to him. While Yun was already holding on to the katana with all his strength that the veins on his hand were already popping out, Cho simply stood there as always and smiled, answering that he didn't know why he was doing this. And again, provoking Yun, the mentor, smiling, asked if Namgung was going to hit him. Yun stared at the mentor and had an internal conversation with himself about what he knew about the opinions of others, that he was crazy. But how crazy you need to be to hit the mentor. And Cho reminded the fighter that he really decided that the guy would leave him behind if there was no money. Yun continued to watch the guy and realized that he didn't like him because, for a mentor, he was not only young, but also terribly arrogant. Namgung continued to think in his head, relying on rumors that the new guy was just an arrogant warrior without any special abilities and also paid to get here. And the most crazy question about Cho being a sodomite, according to the rumors of others, was asked directly by Namgung, to which Cho vividly responded and said that this was not the case at all. Here Yun-ho turned on the provocation and said that now he understood why Cho was pursuing him, which made the mentor already angry as a beast. And the last cry of the guy, that he said that it wasn't so loud, was so loud that the birds sitting in the trees flew into the sky. Mentor Cho persistently came to Namgung's training sessions and sat watching the fighter on the bench. Yun-ho, in turn, was not going to miss a day of his training, and now he was still getting ready for work. Namgung was sorry that the uninvited guest showed up again, but the fighter decided for himself that he had no right to rest. Yun raised his weapon and prepared himself by taking a deep breath and exhaling, fully concentrating on the task at hand. The fighter began training by waving his weapon, and Cho still sat behind him and watched. The next day, both the student and the mentor appeared on the training field. Only one was waving a weapon and the other was sitting on a bench and yawned sweetly. And on the next rather rainy day, the fighter still came to the field to train, walking through puddles. Cho was also on the field and happily greeted Namgung by waving to him while standing under an umbrella. And in the dead of night, when the moon was shining, Yun-ho was training, and Cho was sitting on the bench, almost falling asleep. Even a day later, Namgung was still training, and Cho was lazily lying on the bench eating something. But he asked if the fighter was hungry. But 5 days later, during the next training session, Yun-ho lost his grip and fell, unable to keep his balance. Before his gaze was a clear sky and a scorching sun, and leaves were falling from the trees. Yun lay exhausted on the grass and was dripping with sweat, but he was more tired of the fact that he couldn't do what he wanted. Mentor Cho approached the fighter and told Yun to stop using the three-edged sword method. Namnu turned over on his back and explained that it was important to complete this technique, because how could he practice sword ascension if he could not perfectly complete the three-pronged sword method? Mentor Cho suggested an alternative by asking what about the Namgung family's techniques. Yun-ho asked a rhetorical question. Is the guy really suggesting that he practice family techniques in front of a stranger? Cho Un answered quite logically that it doesn't have to be some kind of secret technique, and gave an example of how at school quite a lot of people know the basic sword techniques of the Namgung family, one of which is the refreshing wind technique. Powerless Yun barely rose to his feet and decided to demonstrate the refreshing wind technique, having already tried so many times and become disappointed. Cho folded his hands and stood watching the fighter, while Yun-ho prepared himself holding the katana in front of him. Yun-ho performs the technique as easily as it corresponds to the name of the method. The fighter was shocked by what he had just done, because before that there were only failures and falls. Namgung felt that just now he was unable to even stand, but now everything was different. Yun-ho felt that it became easy for him to control his breathing, and he continued his training while Cho continued to silently watch. Mentor Hui was pleased with the result because right here and now, before his eyes, a person is being reborn again. Namgung stopped and asked the guy how he understood what exactly needed to be done. Mentor Cho came quite close to Yun and pointed his finger at him and declared that he knew the reason why he could not continue to practice fencing. Yun looked at Cho's finger and thought that this mentor would now tell him yet another nonsense that he had already heard many times. The new mentor saw the fighter's dissatisfied reaction and said that he really knew the reason why he couldn't continue fencing. Namgung removed the mentor's finger from his shoulder and said that he understood the difference between the teacher and other Kuraltans who were trying to profit from the student. At least none of them had watched him for so long, and before he could say anything, Cho interrupted the student. Mentor Cho directly asked the fighter if things weren't different from the very beginning. The teacher's words that most likely at some point the sword skills suddenly changed to such an extent that the fighter was confused, touched Namgung to the quick. For the first time, Yun did not hide his sincere surprise that the teacher had learned such information from somewhere, even though they were complete strangers. Cho noticed that his voiced suspicions left a mark on Yun's face and said that it was quite strange, but he seemed to feel that something was wrong. For the first time in such a long time, Namgung Yun-ho, with more animated features, asked his mentor what he wanted to say. Mentor Cho pointed out the way the student was trained and that was where one of the problems lay. Cho continued to explain that the whole point is that the way of training is wrong, and that's all. He added that the problem is in the fighter's head and not in the body. Yun asked if the mentor wanted to say that the fighter was not cursed and everything was fine with his body, to which Cho Un asked what kind of curse it was, but did not wait for an answer and suggested that perhaps it was really a curse of some kind. Namgung, puzzled, asked what this meant and asked the mentor to explain his statement. Instead of verbal explanations, Cho walked up to the tree and plucked a large branch from it. The guy, in complete silence, removed all the twigs and leaves from the branch so that it became an ordinary stick. And as always, in his comic form, holding a stick in front of him, Cho asked if this kid had become interested and become kinder. The thin part of the plaka, like the tip of a weapon, was on Yun's forehead, and he asked what the mentor was planning. Smiling like a contented child, the guy replied that he had planned exactly what the fighter had thought. Namgung nevertheless asked for clarification whether the mentor wanted to fight with him, to which he heard that a warrior can only learn by meeting face-to-face with the enemy's sword. Cho Un immediately performed a jump from the ground, thinking to himself that they would see if the guy was right when they tested it in practice. The mentor continued his thought out loud in a one-on-one conversation, raising the stick above himself to strike. Yun immediately realized that this was a technique for openly combining energy, being quite educated in this matter. The fighter, having attempted to defend against the blow with the help of his weapon, then remembered that this was a simple, direct attack that concentrated energy passing from the top of the head to the heart. Yun stretched out his arms in front of him and put his training weapon under attack, realizing that it was just a branch. But at that moment, Namgung caught himself that somewhere inside he felt an eerie feeling of fear, and the stick was no longer tiny, but with such a charge of power, like a tree trunk. Being under such a state of a certain numbness, the fighter kept a defense in front of him, but his confidence became significantly less. Suddenly, instead of hitting directly, the stick hit where the water bottle was hanging, and Yun realized that the mentor was quite fast because the fighter couldn't even keep up with him. Yun was frightened by the most terrible thoughts about how he could be so helpless, because these thoughts are self-destructive. Cho stood in front of the loser just as lightly and with a smile and asked if the fighter had really expected such a turn. After such a long time, life was seething in Yun's body, and he asked the mentor to repeat the techniques again. Mentor Cho, of course, agreed to repeat it, being no less excited that he had succeeded. Shui again used the same technique and the technique of blowing wind from all directions, and Yun realized that he knew all these techniques, but for some reason, he still could not dodge any of them. As a result, the water bottle gave up faster than its owner and fell to the ground, breaking off the cord. A joyful Cho at the end of the training told Namgung that this was his limit. The mentor explained to the student that he must monitor the grip of the sword and regulate the speed of the wrist strike because the situation can change depending on how the fighter manages his power, and Yun's problem is that he does not understand how his opponent thinks. Namgung thought that he tried so hard, and that's why it was hard for him to believe that he could never defeat this young mentor. The fighter's hands were red from diligence, and he let his training weapon fall to the ground as if he had given up. The wooden sword fell to the ground, never before being such a heavy burden for a fighter. Mentor Cho laughed so loudly and fervently and asked if Yun agreed that he was a genius and rushed to hug the fighter, shouting to him that he was crazy. All Yun could answer was why the teacher was doing this. Hui did not understand the question but only answered that it was great and added that he really knew, so the fighter would no longer have to suffer. Namgung, embarrassed, pushed the teacher away and told him to let him go, which made Hui laugh even more. Yun said that no matter what the mentor's method is, he doesn't want to be a homosexual, which is why Cho Un went wild again, repeating that he is not interested in men. The mentor noticed something on the student's face that was very surprising and difficult to believe. Cho amusingly leaned towards Yun's face, which was covered with his hand, and asked if the fighter was crying. To which, of course, Namgung replied that his eyes were sweating, and Cho jokingly began to tease the student that he was still crying, and Yun repeated that his eyes were sweating, to which the mentor asked if he was crying because he lost, which was already starting to infuriate him. The conversation between teacher and student continued, and Yun asked if the mentor meant that ordinary people accept the technique as it is, to which teacher Cho answered in the affirmative to the question of the fighter who became more active not only physically, but also mentally. Namgung continued to learn that if they hit the head, then you need to block the head, and if they aim at the legs, then you just need to block the blow or move to avoid an attack on the legs, to which Mentor Cho asked if this was so. Yun-ho cited the words of his grandfather as an argument that wielding a sword is a game of reading an opponent, and after that, the fighter clarified with Cho, "After all, you can only block what you can see and feel," and the teacher replied that it's the same with others. Yun asked that people are not stupid, and how can everything be so simple, to which Cho Un, dissatisfied with the answer, asked the student about what he said about simplicity. The mentor cited Confucius as an argument, who said that if you just look and think, you won't achieve anything, but you have to endlessly think and search. After an example of wisdom, Cho pointed out to Yun that this is the whole problem, because looking at your opponent's technique, you need to predict his next move and the next one with an accuracy of several moves ahead. Namgung absorbed it all like a sponge and gradually began to understand that this meant not just thinking quickly and doing quick calculations in his head. It dawned on Yun that this was a kind of foreseeing the future, and he seemed to feel it with all his being. It would be a blessing if Yun had the ability to be able to predict an opponent's techniques ahead of him, which would help defeat not a stronger opponent but an entire army. But his curse was the enlightenment gained with an unprepared body. Cho sternly addressed the fighter with the words that it is usually not so easy to parry the blow of a sword when it hits the target and a person is afraid of dying. So why not stop the sword right now? Not counting 5 steps ahead and accept it as it is. Considering Yun's long pause in communicating with people and generally leading a hermit's lifestyle, there was a lot of information at one time. Hui warned Namgung that there were some things to pay attention to before he started training. The mentor showed 3 fingers and said that from now on, Yun just needs to remember 3 things. Yun-ho, not believing what was happening to him, asked his mentor again if he would really help the fighter become a better fighter. Cho was already irritated by the passivity and murder of his student, and he asked if he had lived only in deception all his life. Namgung admitted that he really was deceived by a low-grade master, and also bought into the sweet lie of another charlatan that his illness could be cured. The fighter was most ashamed for the fact that he even went to shamanic rituals, but the answer was on the surface. Cho Un did not cry like a fighter tired from walking in a circle for so long, but when Yun began to speak, the wind blew and the mentor's eyes began to water as if he was crying too. The mentor was determined and told the fighter to forget about everything he said and knew, but just need to remember 3 things, the first of which is to change the old-fashioned manner of speaking. Yun said that Cho himself spoke like an old man and thought that he would be older than the mentor, but Hui asked how old the student was. Namgung Yun-ho replied that he was 21 years old, and this was the reason for the mentor's further actions. Mentor Cho, with the words "get it," hit the student on the head with the same stick that he took from the tree. While Yun was rubbing his head in the place where the blow landed, Mentor Cho angrily replied that he was 25 years old. Namgung began to say that, be that as it may, you can't tell from the teacher what to him, but he didn't have time to finish, and the stick flew to exactly the same place a second time, and the teacher said the second rule is never to doubt his words. The third rule was to only call Cho a mentor or an older brother. Yun decided to ask since when the mentor and the elder brother are considered something equivalent, and did it in vain. Mentor Cho mentioned the second rule of not doubting his words, and to reinforce it, he hit the student twice instead of once. The teacher said that now that Yun had understood these 3 sacred truths, it was time to get to work because they had little time left. After 15 days in Dongcheon, everything was ready for the competition. The students stood serious and ready to be selected for the monthly competitions. Head Jong sat in front of the lined-up students looking at all these young faces. A nasty toad Yom stood next to his head, and Jong told the mentor that he saw how all the students had a sparkle in their eyes, and Yom replied that they still carefully taught all these kids. Head Jong was pleased with both what he saw and what he heard, and approving of the overall picture, he said that it was time to start. In front of the students in gray clothes, Mentor Yom in a white robe stood and loudly proclaimed that it was time to start the exam. The nasty toad turned to Sagon, who broke down and became closer to his mentor. Yom announced that since Sagon is the best of the students, he will be the one who will start the big exam. And the student bowed and thanked him. Mentor Yom loudly voiced whether there were any students who were ready to go against Sagon in this exam. Behind Yom, the voice of a wisher was heard, and to everyone's surprise, it was the same ghost of Dongcheon. Sagon was clearly nervous because Yom's plan to make him the best student was no longer in line with their agreement. Yom stood next to Namgung Yun-ho and did not notice who the student bowed in greeting. Raising his head, Yun turned to Mentor Cho, saying that he had come and he was ready, to which a voice that was already familiar to Yom sounded, and he nervously turned in his direction. Toad Yom cursed to himself about how this upstart Jo and Hui could be here. Cho, not paying attention to Yom, approached the student and, holding him by the shoulder, said that Yun had not taken part in the exam for a long time, so he instructed him to do his best. And while Cho continued to talk to Yun about how he regretted that he couldn't personally participate, Yom, behind their back, couldn't help but be in disbelief that Cho had found an approach to Namgung. Yun remembered that 5 years had passed since he took the exam, and already thought in his head that it had taken him by surprise. But even so, no problems would arise. Yom looked at the ghost's back and remembered that when Namgung Yunho first came here as a student, the mentor thought that Yun would be his golden ticket, and Yun was a little hesitant and wondered whether he should really take part. Toad Yom was replaying in his head the story of how Yun's family abandoned him, and he didn't go to group training and stayed away from his mentors. And Mentor Yom concluded that even if the guy has talent, it's insignificant and overall he's a spineless loser. Yom took this situation as another opportunity to kick Cho Un out of here, and he headed to the mentor and student. Yom came closer and called Mentor Cho, and he turned around at the call, not at all expecting that it would be Yom. Toad, with his usual dissatisfied face, said that he didn't think Namgung Yunho deserved to be here. Cho asked if Yom meant disqualifying the student, to which the Toad replied that his skills could disqualify a warrior, as if he wanted to knock the ground out from under his feet. And now Yom, instead of Mentor Hui, turns to the ghost with the question of whether he is wrong, and added what the student Namgung himself thinks about this. Yun silently accepted the poison that this toad was spitting, and at the moment it was the best decision. Yom was pleased with his dirty tongue and concluded that Yun still couldn't say a word against him, and decided for himself that if everything went well, he would show these two their place. Mentor Yom came up and put his heavy hand on Yun's shoulder, clearly not out of friendly intentions, and then said that if he wanted, Yom would take him as his student and teach him everything. Yom continued to poison with words and said that he knows that Yun is in a hurry, but with martial arts he doesn't work like that, no matter how much he studies, and throwing in another seed that a strong rush could turn out to be poison, this already hurt Cho. Namgung, after listening to everything that this nasty toad Yom said, asked what the mentor meant by all the words. Yom explained that he wanted to tell the student not to overdo it today if he didn't want to end up in an awkward position. Namgung once again encountered a hidden threat in his direction and became thoughtful. Mentor Cho always told the truth directly, and now he said after Yom, who was leaving, that if he cared, he should have paid attention to the student earlier and asked why Yom didn't abandon one of his charges like that. Yom stopped and turned dissatisfied to Cho, ready to tell him everything he thought about him. But holding himself back through gritted teeth, Yom said, "Does the guy have any idea how busy the mentor is now? After all, he only has enough time to train special talents." We realized that now it was his move, and, agreeing with Yom's words, the guy smiled to say something equally poisonous. Cho looked carefully at Yom and asked what it was that Namgung Yunho, Mentor Yom, considered an insignificant talent. Yom turned purple and immediately turned away, saying that he didn't mean it at all, but the crowd behind heard what they heard. Mentor Cho turned to student Yun and, as if stirring up interest, asked what he would do now, because Namgung was considered not very important, and Yun realized for himself that Cho was no worse in saying caustic words for Yom. Disciple Namgung Yunho remained silent, thinking it over. After all, a really long time had passed. And raising his head, Yun said with confidence that he would take part in the competition. The poisonous toad Yom became so angry that the veins appeared on his forehead. Head Zhong, still waiting as if sensing something, asked teacher Yom what had happened. Yom got nervous but turned to the head and tried to evade it by saying that this was not a matter that Jun should pay attention to. The head, showing a hand gesture for everyone to speed up, ordered in this case to hurry up. Chief Zhong's words only made Yom even more worried about the change in his ideal plan. There was talk among the students about whether Namgung Yunho would really take part, because a lot of time had passed since he could not use a sword. It was a shame for both the students and mentors. They did not understand what the new guy was thinking about, and only Yomei stood and looked at all this without condemnation. Yomei turned to one of the mentors and said that they still don't know whether Namgung can win, to which the most indignant mentor replied that Yomei seems to know nothing, but Namgung Yunho is a loser who disgraces his family. Mentor Yomei and the mentor looked at Cho and Yun, and the mentor asked the girl that she didn't understand what this meant, because even if the ghost wins, it's not good, because the person who was abandoned by everyone and decided to stand out now is just an annoying hindrance. Yomei couldn't even put in 5 cents as the mentor continued to say incessantly that Yun's younger brother was now serving at the imperial court, And in this case, would anyone allow the forgotten older brother to be remembered? The mentor said that this was news that the Namgung family would never be happy with, and Yom looked at Yun with annoyance. The most key word here is forgotten, because his existence was denied by both his family and the whole world, and this word refers to Namgung Yun-ho. The problem is that Yun-ho himself also knew about this like no one else, and nevertheless decided to speak out. There was no time to delay the competition, and both masters and their students were tuning in for the event. Mentor Cho called his student Namgung Yun-ho to say something important, and the master pointed to the competition area as if inviting the student and told him to have fun. Mentor Yom called his student Sagon to him, clearly not in the mood for a fair fight. Bearing his insidious smile, Yom came close to Sagon and told him something good in his ear so that the student could properly concentrate on this battle. Namely, he asked the question of what Sagon thinks, why they began to treat Yun as a ghost. Sagon began to think out loud that this was a lack of abilities and pulled himself away from this thought. Mentor Yom supported the student that he was right, and the ghost really did not become like this because of a lack of abilities. Yom, wrapping everything up, told Sagon that he had received a request from the Namgung family, namely that they want everyone to forget about their son, Yun-ho. The mentor continued that since the Namgung family asked, isn't it the duty of the Murim warrior to keep his promise? Sagon supported his mentor's insidious plan, saying that Yom was absolutely right. All students who took part in the competition were instructed to take positions. Sagan and Yun-ho entered the field, and Yom stood between them and voiced that everyone has their own achievements. They are different, so you need to be impartial, and added to use only the power of your sword, and in this way, they will judge them. Sagan stood with his eyes closed and prepared to fight, while Mentor Yom continued to voice the conditions that students would be disqualified if they used prohibited techniques. Yun-ho in turn stood in front of Sagan and watched him, and Yom added that killing is prohibited. Master Yom made a hand gesture to start the fight and wished the students good luck. Sagan readied his sword, raising his hand in front of him, which Yun had already noticed. Disciple Sagan put his training weapon fully in front of him, looking carefully at his opponent. Sagan voiced to himself that he would win with the first blow, because he was not determined to fight, but to do what Yom ordered him to do. And so Sagan makes acceleration and the first kicks from the ground, heading towards his opponent. Yun-ho remained standing and watching Sagan attack, and instead of his body, he prepared himself mentally. Namgung recalled training with a mentor who explained that when you learn to wield a sword, don't look further than one step ahead. Yun-ho asked if it was not necessary to think through the opponent's movements in 2 or 3 steps. Cho replied that first one needs to predict only the next attack and consciously refrain from predicting the enemy's actions. Namgung, acting completely differently all this time, asked the mentor if it was normal to calculate only one action in advance. Cho took advantage of the opportunity that the student had forgotten the rule and already raised a stick over Yun's head, asking if he had forgotten his instructions, to which Ho immediately put up a defense, and the rule of not doubting the words of the mentor bounced off the teeth. Mentor Huai was pleased that the student remembered everything correctly and told Yun to hold on until he understood what the next attack would be. They continued their training, and Hui reminded the student to focus on the sword. And so Namgung looks at Sagan running towards him and realized that he sees the attack that the opponent wants to use. Without making much effort, Yun-ho simply smoothly moves to the side, and Sagan's blow goes wide. Sagan makes another attempt to attack from Namgung, spending quite a lot of energy on this. And here is another attempt by Sagan to strike the ghost, and this time the attack came from above, and with both hands. Namgung Yun-ho, unexpectedly for everyone, was able to brilliantly rebuff Sagan by putting himself on defense. Both rivals froze, and Sagan also did not expect that the one who had been ownerless for quite a long time would be able to fight back. Sagan had never heard of such abilities from anyone in Dongcheon, and Yun-ho was glad that right now he knew how to resist a sword and what it felt like. For Namgung, understanding the principle added strength and greatly motivated her to continue. The living force began to churn in the body of the ghost, and this time it was he who made the pushes from the ground for a run. After such a long time, Yun-ho smiled again and ran contentedly towards his opponent, as if not for an attack, but for a friendly greeting. And so Namgung makes a powerful jump, swinging his sword over his head, but Sagan puts up a defense in front of himself. Yun-ho deliberately sent the blow past his opponent, and there was a very small distance between them. The ghost caught himself thinking that he couldn't allow what he really wanted to do. After all, if Yun had made that blow, the competition would have ended too quickly. But Namgung realized that he couldn't just end such an exciting moment after much suffering. The battle dance became more and more dizzying, and if Yun did not make much effort and move smoothly, then Sagan, with rather typical and wooden movements, had every chance of getting exhausted quite quickly. Namgung was overjoyed that he could afford such luxury and thought about how it could be so different. In parallel with the battle, Yun recalled their conversation with the teacher and how Cho asked that Namgung had to go through something before he could look a few steps ahead. Wei also added that Yun could not suddenly gain the ability of foresight without having the necessary skills, after which Namgung clarified what the teacher meant, and Cho explained that it must be something very strong and memorable. Mentor Cho tied his hair with a red ribbon as always, and he asked Yun if anything came to the student's mind. Yun Ho, looking at the curly ribbon, realized that if it was something strong and memorable, then he understood what it was. The student shared with the teacher that several years ago, Yun saw his grandfather dance with his sword. Yun Ho explained that suddenly his grandfather had an epiphany, and he danced with the sword alone. Cho, analyzing, realized that if grandfather Yun Ho, then it must be Shingong, who is called the Silk Tiger Sword, and the dance with the sword that he performed at the moment of enlightenment must have been very exciting. And so we realized that this dance simply could not help but be imprinted in Yun's consciousness, and Cho asked if the student was shocked by this dance on a moonlit night, to which Ho said that he was not that shocked. Cho Un saw Yun's prevarication and began to explain that the student's problem was that since he suddenly saw a huge mountain, he stopped seeing the stone under his feet. Cho also gave an example of how if you look at the sun and then look at a candle flame, it won't seem bright. Namgung recalled that both his father and younger brother saw the sword dance, and he wondered why only he was so captivated by it. Mentor Cho, sitting down on the bench, told the student that this was obvious and all because those two were less talented than Yun. Yun had the epiphany that it turns out that what he considered his curse was, on the contrary, his gift. Namgung timidly stood in front of the teacher and bleated to him about how he could be more capable than his father and brother. Cho was annoyed by the fighter's uncertainty, and he shouted at him that if the teacher tells him something, it means it is so, and if the teacher says to do something, then Yun must do it. Namgung realized that there was no other way, and answered the teacher that he would try, to which Hui shouted that Yun didn't need to try, but just needed to do what was said. The last words of the teacher who caught up with Yun during the battle are that his body has great potential and you shouldn't get too hung up on the movement of the sword. No matter the training or battle, it was worth remembering that on the blade lies the abyss between life and death. And even if you lose in a battle, there are times when you can win if you fight to the death. Yun came to the realization that he would not die if he continued to move, and this thought was large-scale. Sagan was angry and at the same time scared because he could not understand what to expect from a seemingly frail opponent. Namgung struck, but Sagan's defense was rather weak and uncertain. Sagan stood in a completely wrong stance, and one could see in his eyes that this was not at all what he and Yom expected. Yun was analyzing all the time, and now he realized that Sagan was moving too awkwardly and decided to try to compare his opponent with his mentor's sword. Moments of training with his mentor appeared before Namgung's eyes, and the student realized that Cho was faster and brighter. Yun dealt blow after blow, following all the techniques and movements that were in training. While delivering his blows, Yun still tried to understand how his teacher moved, but all the comparisons were not the same. Now Namgung again saw Cho's movements before his eyes, and he realized that the teacher was as fast as lightning. And in parallel with the lightning speed, the student noted for himself that the teacher was strong as a storm. While Namgung's strength only increased, Sagan's strength decreased with each blow. Yun also remembered that Cho was like a whirlwind, but at the same time, he moved quietly like the spring wind. Sagan held on with all his strength, but did not at all expect what happened. Namgung looked at Sagan screaming and tired, and how he, like a wounded beast in agony, was trying to strike. Disciple Yun realized that now was the right moment to finish. Taking the best of his training, Yun realized exactly how he should finish the fight. Namgung Yun Ho realized that if there had been a mentor instead of him, he would have done exactly this and repeated exactly what the teacher did to him during training. This was the last blow of this battle, and Sagan, coughing and breathing heavily, began to lose consciousness. While Namgung completed his blow, Sagan, already exhausted, fell to his knees. Mentor Yom and the others stood with their mouths open, not believing what they saw. The students, no less shocked, began to whisper whether this fighter was really called the Ghost of Dong Cheon, and that all this time he had been hiding such abilities. Yom had veins appearing on his face from excitement, and his teeth were grinding. and in his head he was cursing terribly about the fact that he had failed to carry out his insidious plan. Mentor Hui stood happy and peaceful and understood that this was the end. In front of that very ghost of Dongcheon, whom absolutely everyone doubted, what seemed to be the best student Sagon lay unconscious. As at the beginning of the battle, Mentor Yom stood between Sagon and Namgung, only now with a completely different expression on his face. The students silently watched what would happen, having been initially set up by Yom both against Cho and Namgung. With the same thoughts, the mentors froze, waiting for the words of Mentor Yom. Namgung Yunho stood absolutely calm and only wiped the sweat that was rolling from his face with his hand, and poor Yom hesitantly announced the winner. Mentor Cho, approaching his student, asked what his feelings and impressions of the victory were. Yun Ho was ready to answer something like okay, but he stopped because the feelings were mixed. Yun looked at his hands, which were red and calloused, and thought that he didn't really understand his feelings, as if it was all just a dream. Chui said that Namgung should just enjoy himself and forget about this feeling, and the student asked the teacher if he really wanted to say that Yun should forget about the feeling of victory. Mentor Cho Un, on the contrary, said that he was sure that from now on, Yun would often experience a feeling of victory. Namgung could not believe that he, who always suffered defeat and ran away in regret, would feel victory. And seeing this doubt on the student's face, Mentor Cho asked if he really disagreed. Large tears appeared in Yun's eyes, as if he had not cried for an eternity. And the lips of the mouth and chin clenched because just before the bitterest tears, a person's facial expressions change. When Yun finally realized that he had won and allowed this feeling within himself, he fell to his knees in front of the master, holding his sword. Tears rolled down Namgung's face in large hail, and he cried out in mental pain. Mentor Cho was surprised that the student was crying again, but did not force him to stop, but rather was simply there. Water poured from the fighter's eyes as if washing his wounded soul, and a scream frantically tore from his chest. Namgung Yunho cried like a beast until he cried out the remaining tangle of emotions from pain and resentment. Mentor Cho continued to stand next to the student and understood that this guy seemed to have a very difficult time. While Yun was coming to his senses, someone called Mentor Cho and asked him to give him some of his time. We saw that it was that same nasty and poisonous toad. Yom and the guy smiled and replied that of course he would take the time. Cho cheerfully hummed some melody to himself and followed Mentor Yom. The mentors came to one of the Dongcheon buildings in which, naturally, at that moment there was no one else except them. Mentor Yom let Cho go ahead and then went in himself and locked the door behind him, looking sternly at the guy. Barely holding himself together so as not to break down, Yom asked what Cho was thinking and what he was doing. Mentor Cho, although he perfectly understood what this toad meant, but fell for a fool and said that he did not understand what Mentor Yom was talking about and what he was trying to tell Cho. Mentor Yom turned into a red bloated ball, holding his hand in front of him and muttering through his teeth that he meant that kid Namgung. Yom exhaled and curbed himself, and then told Cho to give him Yunho for good, to which the new mentor quite logically asked the question, why Yom talks about the student as if he were some kind of thing. Yom dismissed the fact that Yun wasn't initially under his leadership, and the mentor was simply busy with other work, so there was no time to properly deal with the guy. The nasty swan toad threw Cho something like gratitude that the new guy taught him this time, and casually added that the guy did a good job, but Hui replied that he didn't teach Yunho to receive compliments. Also, Cho Un Hui said that teaching martial arts to Dongcheon students is the job of a mentor, which made Yom furious and muttered that he was just going to talk to the guy. Yom no longer tried to calm down, and if earlier he had spat behind Cho's back, now he did it right in front of him, showing his disrespect in his face. Crackling his fists, this toad said that in fact he did not like Cho from the very first day he appeared here. Mentor Cho, even here, could not do without a sense of humor and, giggling, asked Yom why he brought him to such a creepy place. Yom replied that it was so, and now they could talk directly, and flexing his fists, told the guy that there was no better way to communicate than this. Cho Un smiled and told Yom that this was the nicest thing he had ever heard from him. Yom was suddenly puzzled not only by Cho's strange answer, but also by the appearance he had acquired. To be sure, Cho repeated to poor Yom that such a conversation with fists is just Hui's thing. The unfortunate toad still didn't understand who he was dealing with, and raising his hand at Cho said that the guy had really gone crazy. Cho grabs Yom's hand on the fly, just as he once grabbed the hand of the man holding him by the hair. Cho twisted the toad's hand behind his back and said that the caterpillar should eat pine needles and, by analogy, asked Yom why the new mentor continues to feel hungry when he tries to eat at least something. But you can't say that from Yom. Mentor Cho hit Yom on the inside of his knee, saying that his eye level was too high. Yom was already on his knees, screaming and sniffling in pain, while Hui simply held his hand by the little finger. Due to the fact that the toad was too loud, Cho asked him to be quieter, and with one clear blow to the neck, he deprived the poor fellow of his voice. Gloating, Cho said that now that they seemed to be on approximately the same level, they can talk, and asked Yom that this is the very method of communication that he was talking about. His strength awakened in Cho so much that the ribbon broke from his hair, which was also torn to freedom, and Cho asked Yom if he liked what was happening. But Mentor Yom, unfortunately, could not even make a sound, let alone words. Mentor Cho, although he possessed colossal power, was still a man and, turning to Yom, he cautioned that he would sort out his affairs himself, so Yom needn't worry. Mentor Yom realized that he not only lost his voice, but also could not use his power to do anything. Cho, as always, jokingly lowered himself to Yom's head and said that it was really good here, and added that most likely no one would hear, even if Yom died here. Teacher Cho noticed that Yom seemed to prefer this kind of talk. And being very close to Yom's head, Mentor Cho smiled like crazy and asked if they could talk like this more often. Having shown Yom his amethyst eyes shining with energy, Mentor Cho asked what Yom would say about such conversations. It was as if Mentor Yom looked into the eyes of death itself, felt a real threat, and realized that there were chances that he could really die. Hui, holding Yom by the scruff of the neck like a kitten, looked him carefully in the eyes and called him by name. And then Cho continued that if the toad wants, then let him continue to show his character, from which Yom turned away. But the guy warned that with such success, it will be clear which of them will regret in the future. They knocked on the door and called one and the other mentor and asked if everything was okay. By Cho's voice, he realized that it was Yomei and looked out from behind the door, asking how she knew that Cho was here. And the girl asked again if everything was okay and asked why his hair was down. Yomei said that she saw how the mentors walked here together and added that it is not easy to move unnoticed when being a poisonous toad. To which Cho asked in surprise what kind of toad and felt that there was really no ribbon. Mentor Yo explained that among mentors, Toad is the nickname of Teacher Yom when he is very angry, and quietly added that if he hears this, there will be problems, to which Cho asked to stop talking about toads and better go to the cafeteria. Teacher Yom was trembling and remained sitting outside the door on the floor, gradually coming to his senses. Yom heard Mentor Yomei talk about the fact that he was a toad among others and couldn't believe it, which made him feel offended. In the main building of Dongcheon, there was a dialogue between Chief Jun and Mentor Cho, and the chief asked if the guy repented that it was a little cruel. Mentor Cho asked what the head meant, and he explained that the guy has one student and he receives a salary from the Murim Alliance. Cho rubbed his nose out of pride and said that this student won the exam, which the head himself saw. Head Jong showed his fingers and said 3, and Cho asked what the head meant. Jun said that in addition to the excellent Namgung, the guy must take responsibility for 3 more people, because there is a rule that a mentor in Dongcheon must be responsible for at least 3 students, to which Cho objected where there is such a rule. Head Jong threw a notebook with words to Hui so that he could carefully read the manuscripts. Mentor Cho flipped through the notebook to the right moment and was extremely dissatisfied with the fact that he found such a rule. Cho launched a cunning like a spear about the fact that he was a new mentor, and wouldn't it be too much to entrust him with training 3 people at once? Like a shield, Head Jong put forward the argument that usually a mentor supervises about a dozen students. And now the spear of cunning breaks against the shield of the law, and Jun voiced the Fox Cho, which gives him a month to take custody of 3 students, and added that Dongcheon does not need a mentor who cannot fulfill his minimum duties. Head Jong, in order to finally finish off the enemy, so to speak, in his arguments, said that among the new mentors there are those who are responsible for 30 students. The training field looked very structured from a bird's eye view. Just at this moment, the students were training on the field, all as if for selection. As one, they performed the movements. Teacher Yo Mei stood in front of the students and observed the correct execution of the techniques. Mentor Cho clearly did not suspect that in the person of the new mentor, who was responsible for 30 students, a girl. Yo Mei, in turn, indifferently replied that she was already tired of this, so she was no longer going to take on any responsibility. Mentor Cho jokingly replied that the girl was very perceptive and explained that he had just returned from the head and he was ordered to take charge of at least 3 more students. Yomei asked what about her students, and Cho, unable to resist a joke, asked if it was a test and added that if Yomei is a good friend, she might share one. Mentor Yo said irritably that Hui was acting ridiculous again, but the guy was pleased. Master Cho, as if he wanted to be persuaded to look at the students, smiled and began to observe. If it weren't for their different statures and hairstyles, the young fighters moved almost identically to each other, like one mechanism. Mentor Cho indicated to Yo-mei that capable students are always in sight, and Mentor Yo was proud of this because she had invested all her might in this teaching. Without thinking twice, Master Cho pointed his finger at the first student in the second row. The second student to fall under the mentor's hand was the fifth student in the third row. And the third choice of the teacher was the first student in the first row who stood out from the general background. Teacher Yo was amazed how Teacher Cho was able to choose students just by looking at them. Yo-mei was surprised for a reason because it took her a month of observation to notice anything. Mentor Hui explained to his colleague Yo-mei that even if the students perform the same movements, there is a slight difference that depends on the skills, and the students he has chosen have a more lively tip of the sword. This can be seen in the dance with weapons, and if some perform the dance like everyone else, that is, those who seem to be imbued with the dance. Teacher Yo pointed to one of the students and asked Teacher Hui what he thought about the dance technique. The mentor's hand pointed to the fighter who was performing the dance in an unusual way. Mentor Ho did not quite understand this rather strange dance in his opinion. At night, the sky was thickly strewn with stars, and in some places small clouds floated by like ships. Among the visitors to the dining room were mentors Yo-mei and Cho, who ate deliciously and had a conversation. The girl asked Cho if he didn't initially want to go to the soup kitchen, to which Teacher Cho replied that he wouldn't want to eat food today, and Yo-mei joked that the guy came here because she would pay for the food today. Mentor Cho brushed it off, calling it nonsense that he was eating at Yo-mei's expense, but still asked why she suddenly decided to treat him to lunch. And Mei explained that she had a request to her mentor. But at the moment when Cho wanted to find out what the request was, with an apology for being late, Teacher Mo came up with anticipation to tell what happened. Mo's interesting story began with the idea that as soon as you start leaving work, something inevitably happens. Mo sat down at the table and asked to bring her a drink, and Mentor Cho again reminded her of the incident that Mo's mentor wanted to tell. Mo admitted before telling everything that she was very ashamed of what happened. Savoring her drink, the mentor began with the fact that there was a fight, and if usually disputes happen between students, this time the student got into a fight with the mentor. While Mo refilled her cup with drink, Mentor Cho was surprised by what he heard. And having filled the cup almost to the brim, Mo explained that the worst thing was beating the mentor to such an extent that there was no living space left on him, and everything happened in front of other students. The teacher also mentioned, by the way, that an attack on a teacher entails immediate disciplinary punishment. But Cho did not hear the story to the end because he noticed that both sisters were already drunk. Mentor Hui could only watch the girls, and he concluded that these two become more animated when they meet. Mo looked away from her conversation with her sister Mei and remembered that Cho did it after all. Mo suggested that everyone must have been surprised at how they were treated by a new mentor whose weight was ignored. Cho chewed and at the same time explained that because of this, the hassle had only increased because he now needed to take on more students. Mo still remained sure that everyone was upset because Cho rediscovered for everyone the talent of the one who was rejected, and Cho confirmed that everyone had a terrible look. Mentor Mo laughed loudly, raising the cup of drink, and agreed with Cho that they were all terrible, but she knew that Cho Un would succeed. That evening, Mentor Cho also joined in the drinking. Both sisters painfully persuaded him. In the dorm where Cho was placed, the lights were still on in some rooms, and Mei and Cho's room was no exception. Mentor Hui was already slightly drunk, so he staggered and plopped down on the bed, exhaling heavily. Where there was a hole in the wall, there was a piece of fabric hanging, and Cho, lying on the bed, noticed its movement. Hui lifted the piece of paper and saw Mei's blushing face there, and the girl thanked her mentor for the time they spent together. Cho reciprocated and added that he also had fun and said that perhaps they would drink so often in the future. Mei remembered that she wanted to ask for a request, and Cho asked what it was. The girl asked if Cho could consult one of her students and give her some recommendations. Hui happily replied that today he drank and ate at the mentor's expense, so he agreed to help. The next morning, despite the evening drinking, Mentor Cho and Mei were on the training field. Mei pointed to a student with braids who was dancing a ridiculous dance that Cho didn't like right away. Mei's mentor explained that at some point the student stopped training with everyone, and now she does these movements alone. Cho realized his mistake by making a promise in a drunken state while Mei had already ordered the students to get ready and warm up. Teacher Mei called each student by name, indicating what they should do, and Cho decided to try to leave quietly. Hui mentally asked Mei for forgiveness, because in the case of that student, nothing would help, and the guy realized how much he just wanted to run away this time. And then May grabs Hui's shoulder with her hand, pointing him again in the direction of the student, and the guy realized that the mentor is too attentive. Mentor Cho walked towards the student as if on a death sentence while she wiped her face after training. The student said Ryan Ryong, and immediately a servant appeared who put up a chair and opened an umbrella, and also took the training sword from the mistress. The servant gave the mistress cold water and asked if the mistress was tired because there was also honey water for that. Cho's desire to give recommendations at the sight of the maid decreased significantly, and he remembered that he had heard about people born with a golden spoon in their mouth and how they could not live without servants, but he did not expect to see it here. Mentor Hui thought as he came closer and was able to see the student's face, after which he realized that he felt as if he had already seen her somewhere. The maid, doing her job, immediately reacted to the rather short distance between Cho and the student. Covering her mistress with her whole body, the maid flew like an animal at Cho, asking if he had any business with her mistress. Cho calmly replied that he had nothing to do, but interrupting the mentor mid-sentence, the maid immediately bared her teeth and began bombarding him with questions from the family, whether he knew who his mistress was, and without waiting for an answer, she answered herself that it was the princess of the Pakri family. After Cho was threatened to adhere to etiquette, he couldn't even really answer anything but only turned around to leave. Hui shouted to Mei that he had done everything he could, but at the same moment the student herself, calling her servant, ordered her to leave. The maid, doing her job, warned the mistress that she could not talk to a lonely man like that, especially with such a dirty tramp. The last words about the tramp angered Cho, and the maid continued to explain something to her mistress. Ryong reminded the student that she is from the Pakri family and is the precious treasure of the family, and that man is not the right person to deal with. But the student replied that everything is fine. The student folded her hands and turned to Cho and asked if he was the same person. A very sweet-looking girl said that she heard about Mentor Cho from Mentor Mei. The lady smiled and asked if Cho really should consult her. Mentor Hui looked at this young talent and wondered if he really should take care of this little one. History has it that swordmasters belonging to great families even stood at the head of the Marima alliance for a time. After all, the martial arts of the Pakri family are unique, one of which is the white dragon sword. When the swordsmen of the Pakri family reach their epiphany, a white dragon can be seen dancing with the sword, demonstrating the illusion of a roar, which is why the great Pakri family is also called the White Sword Dragons. Nothing lasts forever, and therefore, at the moment when Monchon began their dominance, the Bakery family fell apart, and the head knelt down and crawled on the ground barking like a dog in order to save his life. Mentor Cho mentioned to the princess that she was good at the very beginning of her training and asked why she didn't study the school's techniques, and the princess, in turn, explained that since she was the treasure of the Pakri family, she was obliged to master a special martial art. The princess rather dismissed the fact that she didn't like the basic techniques that even dogs and cows could learn. Cho listened to the princess, whose words were quite expected, and he understood that the only right decision would be to simply leave. The lady wanted to get closer to the point and called Ryan Ryong, who appeared nearby like lightning. Ryan understood her mistress without words and poured out various jewelry from the bag onto the table. Cho did not show any sign of looking at the jewelry, and the princess explained that if the mentor could help her master a new style of swordsmanship, and after the words, "You can take away everything in the bag," Cho's eyes sparkled. Hui looked at the pearls, stones, and gold that every now and then sparkled in the sun, and the princess continued that if something is needed for her training, the mentor can ask for it, and also listed the benefits of helping her in the form of fulfilling any whim, even up to a good personalized sword. The princess looked at Hui and asked, after all that had been said, whether the mentor could help her. Mentor Cho immediately fell to his knees before the princess in admiration. Mentor Cho and the student moved to the training field in the school garden. Cho greeted the lady with folded hands as usual and bowed to her. The princess reminded the teacher, with particular importance, that she does not study martial arts for everyone, because in the Pakri family, she has access to special martial arts that are available only to her. Mentor Cho, remembering the bag of jewelry, nodded to the princess and replied that he understood everything. The lady continued that she has this access not only because she is the treasure of the family. The princess indicated that allowing her to study secret martial arts meant that she was a genius, and that she was gorgeous and also strong and cool, and all the while Ryan clapped for her mistress. Spinning like a flower in the wind, the lady asked what the mentor's special skill was, since he undertook to teach her. Cho did not miss the opportunity to joke, and pointing his finger at himself, questioningly said that it was his face, which is why both ladies were in a stupor. Ryong and the princess began to look at Cho with interest, but even here he could not do without humor, So he warned the ladies not to look so closely because if they fall in love, problems will arise. For the lady, the teacher's answer that his special skill was his face sounded so strange that for a moment she was even speechless. But handing Mentor Cho a sword for training, the princess once again asked about Hui's abilities as a master. Mentor Cho Un took the training sword and answered the princess that he was good at using a sword and a knife. The treasure of the family Pakri clarified that the sword and knife are the specialty of the master. Cho and Hui slightly corrected the princess's judgment about his specialty and named the sword. Also, Master Hui was excellent with a knife and a spear and did not forget to mention the club. Mentor Cho, holding a training sword in his hands, imagined how he pulled the bowstring and said that he could also use a bow, adding to everything that he could perfectly use any weapon. The princess was irritated because she thought that the master was mocking her, explaining that it was difficult to ideally master even one weapon, and the master said that he specialized in all of them. Mentor Cho answered absolutely honestly that he was in no way lying, but the princess persisted and mentioned that Hui had recently lied about having a beautiful face. Cho raised his thick bangs and said that he was not lying, and the lady again seemed speechless. The young talent looked at her mentor as if spellbound, without making a sound or even moving. Only Ryan Ryong was able to return her mistress from heaven to earth, calling her as if reminding and warning who she was. The treasure blushed all over with embarrassment and, in an attempt to curb herself, became strict again and stubbornly stated that she could not believe that the master had mastered every weapon perfectly, and then even threatened that if Cho did not help her, she would mercilessly fire him. Mentor Hui unquestioningly agreed with the lady, and he himself thought how picky this little employer is. Mentor Yom approached Mentor Cho and indignantly asked what the master was even thinking about. Hui quite seriously replied that he was simply trying to guide a student who had lost his way. Yome clarified that she meant the master's bow in front of the princess with cries of madam that she saw. Mentor Yo blushed, indicating that she was terribly ashamed of such an act by Master Cho, and this amused the guy. Mei was seriously angry at how Cho reacted to this even now, standing in front of her and laughing. Mentor Cho, not without a sense of humor in himself, continued smiling and said that this was such an incident that it would be impossible not to laugh at it. Putting jokes aside, Shui asked why such a respectable person ended up in this school. Mei explained that the Pakri are a big family, and they have branches all over the continent, and this is one of them in this area. Mentor Yo also added that the branch of the family is located in the endless city in Wuhan, where the school is located, and Pakri Sol is the only daughter in the family. Master Cho expressed his assumptions that the Pakri family probably made a lot of efforts to get an estate where there is the Marima Alliance and a new school, and Yomei confirmed the words of her colleague and clarified that Pakri Sol is a direct blood descendant. Mentor Cho additionally inquired whether it was true that the Pakri family were adherents of the heavenly faction. Mei answered in the affirmative and added that it was not surprising that the Pakri sword family supported the celestial faction. Mentor Cho gained enough important and valuable information for himself that can also be no worse than a weapon. The guy smiled in anticipation of interesting training with the nobleman Saul and realized that time would tell how everything would turn out. The day was beautiful thanks to the clear and warm weather, and the trees were basking in the sun. In the garden on the training field, Princess Sol was dancing, and Hui was sitting on a bench and watching. And Namgung came up to him from behind, asking if everything was okay with the master. Sol swung her sword at full speed so Hui could calmly take a break from training. Mentor Cho told his student Yun Ho that everything was fine and continued to watch the princess. Namgung, wanting to warn the master, asked if he knew that he could be fired if he cheated money from his students. Cho didn't even look in Yun's direction, but simply answered, moving the needle, that Namgung has no money, so he has nothing to worry about. Yun Ho silently accepted the master's sarcasm and tried to fence him off again, reminding him that the bakery family is not gentle and kind, and if something goes wrong, you won't get away with a refund. Namgung looked at his mentor and thought that he had a slightly strange character, but he liked this meticulous and calm teacher. And so Yun decided that someday he would definitely repay the teaching, even if the price was his life. Mentor Hui smiled and asked Yun in a friendly manner not to worry and stop muttering so much. Namgung silently accepted the mentor's request, but the student remained as if on guard. The clouds in the sky acquired a pleasant creamy hue, which was colored by the setting sun. Poor Sol was breathing heavily and was terribly tired, but she asked the master what he would say about her training. Sol explained that what she was studying was the best technique in the world for wielding a double blade, and clarified that it was incredibly powerful, but, according to the princess's brilliant intuition, it was not yet ideal. The princess suggested that it was worthwhile to refine the technique in the transitions from the third to the fourth movement and from the sixth to the seventh. And Cho asked again what Sol said about the incompleteness of the technique. Mrs. Sol stood with her hands on her hips and stated that it was unfinished because she was more special, and Cho decided to play a little joke by asking the princess to show again her highest technique of playing with a sword, which made the girl terribly angry. Master Cho, or rather even the master of sarcasm, clarified with Sol that it would be okay if she showed him some kind of greatest technique. The teacher awakened the beast in the princess, and she ran up to the master, stomping her foot and shouting, repeating the correct name of her technique. Having let off steam, Sol turned her back to the master and explained that all this is necessary for perfect mastery of martial art, so she shows the teacher her skills so that he can tell where the girl might be making mistakes. And then another day of training came and the princess danced, and Master Cho sat on the bench and watched. The mentor mostly just watched and was silent, and Ryan Ryung sat next to him, also watching the mistress. Again training and again dancing Sol, and the silent Master Hui watching the movements of the student. Cho took advantage of the fact that he was the master of the princess herself, so he clapped his hands and said that he didn't mind eating. Ryan Ryung opened a box of food that looked very appetizing, and there were only 2 pieces. The mentor was glad that he could take advantage of such privileges, and Ryun, looking at the master's grin, suspected something was wrong. The weather that day was cloudy, but Sol was still training, and, in addition to the master and Ryong, Yun Ho was also watching her. Hui noticed that Ryong was holding a wooden round box covered with a cloth in his hands and asked what it was, and the servant replied that these snacks were specially sent from Wuhanjiang for the lady. Cho took the entire box of sweets and, continuing to sit on the bench, gobbled it up on both cheeks. Ryung was as unhappy with this charlatan now as before, and Namgung was ashamed of his teacher. The mentor told Namgung to also help himself and handed him some sweets, but the student refused. Yunho wanted to ask the master more about Princess Sol and her training. Namgung, watching the princess and understanding what was really happening, asked Cho if everything would be okay with the lady. Ryan Ryung also asked if the lady would get injured at this rate, because she is primarily responsible for the safety of the princess. Cho Un continued to eat sweets and responded to all his worries about Sol that everything would be fine. On another day, when Sol was training, Namgung asked the master if everything should happen like this, which Hui did not understand. Yunho explained that he simply meant the mentor's observation of how the lady has been training for several days in a row, and Cho replied that the teacher's responsibilities include monitoring the student's growth. Namgung did not stop his meticulous lectures and said that if the girl continues to handle her sword like this, her muscles and energy will be damaged. Yoon also concluded that this method of testing abilities is useless because the mind and the sword exist separately. The student noticed things that the teacher had not voiced during all this time, namely that swinging a sword with all his might and so recklessly salt could damage ligaments or muscles. Cho responded to this long monologue of his student with only one word that he knows. Wai understood everything a long time ago and put it on his shelves, in particular that the sword technique that Sol studied was non-standard because her heart alone rules and the sword moves completely as he pleases. If the mentor were explaining this to someone, he would say that it felt like she was doing a long run at full speed with calm breathing, the same as when falling asleep. As a conclusion, Cho concluded that if the mind and sword are not synchronized, then the body will be destroyed, and as if reading the teacher's thoughts, Yun said that perhaps the lady would not even be able to raise her sword again. Namgung was shocked by the mentor's indifference because with him he was different, and therefore asked if the teacher really knew everything but would remain silent. Master Cho replied that he would continue to do so, and his eyes burned with amethyst power. The master and student looked at the princess, and the poor thing was already out of breath and wet as if after rain. Another fine day and another training session in which Cho was already lying on the bench eating sweets for the princess, and at the same time told Yunho that if he continues to stand like this, then let him come closer and cover the sun for him. The mentor jokingly began to be indignant that the only teacher Yun's eyes were terribly blinding, and he was treating him like this and called him callous. Sol stopped her movements and firmly took the training sword in her hands. The princess stood still for a moment and then changed her face. The long-awaited shadow appeared above Cho's face, but it was not Yunho but Princess Sol. The girl stood over her mentor, burning with rage and continuing to hold the sword in her hand. Sol cursed at Master Hui for why he was just watching her for 10 days straight. The princess began to come closer to the teacher in order to express even more of her dissatisfaction, but Cho, as if nothing had happened, warned the girl that if she came closer, he would see her underwear. The master ensured himself from danger and continued to lie there and eat sweets. Sol could not resist and shouted for the master to do his job properly, and Hui asked again that he was already doing everything correctly. The princess realized that there was nothing to catch here and ordered Ryong that they return to Mentor Yo, and the servant obediently snatched the basket of sweets from Cho and went after the mistress. Ryong walked next to the princess and consoled her, saying that her time was just wasted. That's when Mentor Cho entered the game, slamming his fist into his hand and making a sound of disappointment. The still angry lady turned around and said that it was too late to change anything. Even Cho was sorry. Mentor Hui, in his cunning manner, said that this is very sad because he knows the secret of how to improve the technique, and now Salt the fish is on the hook. The princess, who just a second ago was more furious than any animal, turned to the master with childish, genuine surprise. But Sol kept herself under control and warned her mentor that if he wants to stop her again with the help of lies, then this will not happen. Master Hui explained absolutely seriously, and without joking, that to use the double blade technique, you need 2 swords, and for further form transformation techniques, you also need 2 swords. After these recommendations, the teacher turned to Yun Ho standing next to him and took the sword from his student, indignant that he was not a bodyguard to hold the weapon so tightly. Teacher Cho threw the second sword to Sol and she deftly grabbed it with her hand as if it were a ball. When the princess had both swords in her hands, Master Cho suggested that she try to perform the technique in this way, but Sol asked the mentor if he understood that during the dance the swords would collide with each other. Mentor Cho calmly explained that if he turns out to be wrong, then the princess can return to Mentor Yo at any time, and still suggested that Sol try to perform the technique. Sol Pakri crossed her swords, and it was clear that she was not entirely sure of this, but her interest was already sparked. Mentor Cho accompanied Sol with his instructions that first point the swords towards the ground, and then continue the technique as usual but stand on one leg, and most importantly, spread the rotation that began from the tips of the sword, and transfer it to the tips of the toes. And in that moment where Sol usually failed, this time Mentor Cho caught the moment and commanded her to make a blow. It was difficult for Princess Sol to hold this blow because its power was great, but he did not give up. The lady looked to where what she had been working towards for so long and persistently was taking shape. Cho Un understood that this was the most important moment and shouted to Sol that she needed to withstand this blow. The student heard her mentor and made every effort to hold the swords together. And here is that very moment of enlightenment in which everyone sees some kind of image in their technique, and in Sol's it resembled a bird. The princess remained standing in place with her arms outstretched, and she felt that everything had worked out. Master Cho watched what looked like the flapping of the wings of a huge white crane as it rose to the skies. When the dance was completed, Sol Pakri turned in the direction where everyone usually watched her training. The girl looked at the mentor who, filled with pride, did not miss any moment from this dance. Master Cho expressed his recommendation to the princess that he would call this technique White Crane Ascension. Student Yun Ho was even more shocked than the student, and it was difficult for him to believe that what happened now was possible. Yun began to have thoughts and questions swirling in her head, one of which was whether the master had come up with the technique simply by explaining to the princess what to do. Everyone who teaches and studies knows that, as a rule, when teaching the art of combat in a neutral faction, sword techniques are taught only after numerous basic trainings. The reason for such a long journey to sword techniques is that the student must know in what situations it is worth using the sword and what skills are best to use, and usually this was the part of the training where the mentor's effort was greater. As a result, it turns out that no matter what style the master adheres to, if the student does not get a good base, then the master will not be able to continue teaching the student properly, and Yunho understood that this also applies to Sol Bakery. Knowing all the canons and rules of martial art, Yun did not understand how the girl was able to reproduce the technique as needed in an instant, only with the help of general movements and the recommendations of her mentor. Yunho realized that he was able to see something amazing, namely how Sol Bakery's talent was revealed. The realization that the dance that the princess recently could not bring to perfection has now turned into an excellent technique has kindled the fire of dance in Namgung. Yunho took the sword and outlined for himself an important rule of survival in battle, namely, to develop the habit of paying attention to the opponent's strengths instead of looking at the weaknesses. Student Yun was inspired by Seol's dance and awakened his power, remembering how not so long ago he was called the ghost of Dong Cheon, and that now he is in no position to evaluate anyone. And so Namgung Yunho also started dancing with his sword, unable to hold this energy inside. Like a cold flame, Yunho was surrounded by his energy, merging with the sword into one in a battle dance. Mentor Cho continued to sit on the bench watching his two students and eating sweets without a twinge of conscience. The master smiled looking at Sol and Yun, and thought that they were both like happy children. But no matter how nice it all looked, Mentor Cho still understood that both students were strong enough, which he was also pleased with. Sol Pakri's training did not stop there, because she wanted to bring the technique to perfection, and therefore, even after 15 days, she continued her training. The princess's movements became smoother but at the same time dexterous, and she easily moved across the field dancing with swords. Throwing her hand forward for a lightning attack, the girl launched her sword like an arrow. The sword flew right through the wooden training figure, cutting through it like a hot knife through butter. Mentor Cho looked displeased at the figure cut in half and began to be indignant that it had to be repaired again. Sol Pakri, out of breath, looked towards the figure and remained motionless, which worried the servant. Ryong went up to her mistress to ask if everything was okay because the girl didn't have a face. And the princess burst into tears of happiness because she finally managed to bring the technique to perfection. Ryong stroked the lady, trying to console her, and the girl wiped away her tears with her sleeve, while Mentor Cho, having heard out of the corner of his ear what was happening, was pleased with the result of his work and the breakthrough of the princess. Sol Pakri calmed down and proudly stated that she knew that she would succeed. The girl began to praise herself and remind herself that she was a genius, and she was the princess of the great Pakri family and their priceless treasure. The master smiled and answered the young talent that he also knew that she could do it. Perhaps the princess was not used to hearing that someone else really believed in her, or she was already accustomed to the teacher's sarcasm, so she could not at first believe in Cho's words, but he assured her, reminding her that he was really speaking empty words. Sol laughed loudly and cheerfully with joy that the master really believed in her. But Cho would not have been Cho if he had not ruined this joyful moment again, with his remark that since the princess broke her figure for training, she should fix it. But Sol was not upset. It was on that day that all 4 unfinished techniques were completed, and after training, Sol Pakri invited Cho and Yun to her room. And when they arrived, Sol joyfully asked if the room was not big. The princess also asked if looking at her room you could feel how much her family cared about her. Mentor Cho looked at everything around him, so he answered after some time, shifting his focus to the lady's question and confirmed that everything was as she said. Namgung silently analyzed what he saw and felt, and there was something strange about it all for him. Looking to one side of the room, it was indeed spacious and reserved for a student of a different level, but it was empty. On the other side of the room, where there were also a lot of shelves for placing books or other things, was empty. Ryong was very quick and had already set the table and offered tea to the guests. But Mentor Cho refused, and instead of tea, he asked if there was alcohol. Sol remembered that she didn't call the master to show off the large room, and while she was going to get what she needed, snacks and drinks appeared on the table. The lady indicated that the master was here to repay for his work as promised, and clarified that he would give Mentor Cho whatever he wanted, because the Pakri family is not stingy with gratitude. The joyful princess asked her master what he would like as a reward for the work done. Mentor Cho, savoring his drink, began to think out loud about what he really wanted and winked at the princess and said that there was something. Sol Pakri was a little puzzled, but asked again that in her thoughts what the master wanted was money. And Mentor Cho confirmed that this is a relationship that started with money, so is it wrong to end it with money too? The lady turned to Ryong and asked her to bring everything she needed, and the assistant obediently left. Ryong brought and placed on the table a chest with 30 silver won beautifully arranged in rows. Mentor Cho, looking at the reward, began to calculate that 1 won is equal to 20 coins, and thus there are 600 of them here, while the monthly salary in Dongcheon is 10 silver coins, so it is worth saving. The master was happy, but Namgung, looking at Cho, could not understand how a mentor could teach only for money, because this is not what a Kanho warrior should do. For the first time, the student was disappointed in his teacher, because after so long a time they will be able to gain at least some hope. Yunho sat saddened because he thought that Master Cho was different from other mentors. But at some point it dawned on the student, realizing what the mentor might have planned. Namgung remembered that the master said that he had to find students for himself, and given Cho's character, it would be difficult for him to do this. Yoon also added to everything that Bakery Sol has real talent, and perhaps she's even stronger than his younger brother, the genius of the Namgung family. Yoon continued to analyze the situation and wondered why a person with similar abilities from the Baekri family decided to study in Dongcheon. And the student also did not forget about the room, because what is very striking is that this large room is empty and without any decor. Mentor Cho thanked Saul and again reminded her that she had also done a good job and said about the money that she would use it for a good cause, and the princess was surprised that the master was already leaving. Cho Un smiled and said that he was really leaving and was going to visit Wuhanjiang with the goal of getting even more money soon. Mentor Cho and student Yoon stood at the door about to leave, and Sol promised that she would definitely keep her word, because as soon as she said it, her father would even give out gold coins. The master comfortingly stroked Sol on the head, reassuring her that everything was fine, and again reminded her that all this time she had worked hard, and added that Kanho is small, so if there's another opportunity they will see each other. The girl was a little embarrassed and lowered her gaze to the floor, but replied that of course she would see each other again. Almost leaving, Mentor Cho turned to Ryong, thanking him for the snacks, which were very tasty. The master slowly walked forward, holding a bundle of fabric behind his back, which contained a chest, and behind him Namgung walked a little behind. Disciple Yoon turned to Mentor Cho Un, because he wanted to know something about the lady from the bakery house. The teacher turned around and told Yoon not to worry in vain. Cho added that he knew very well what the student was so worried about. Yoon-ho realized at that moment that the teacher understood everything and seemed to have his own thoughts about Bakery Soul, and he even noticed the disappointment of his student. Mentor Cho voiced his thoughts that Yoon-ho was ready to find out the truth without giving in to temptation, and asked if the student was ready for a new lesson. Namgung did not understand at all what this mentor was thinking about and what was going on in his head, but he replied that he was ready. And although Yoon did not understand the thoughts of his teacher, he thought that if he followed him, he would understand everything. Evening came and the lanterns were lit in the rooms, thanks to which a special atmosphere was created. Yoon-ho had Master Cho's words in his head about dressing up well, but without explaining why. For the student, there were already prepared and folded clothes on the bench that looked better than what he had been wearing for a long time. Namgung got dressed and remembered that several years had passed since he last wore his family's silk clothes. For the first time, Yoon-ho preened himself as if he were going to some important event. The young man also decided to tie his hair, which almost completely covered his face when it was loose. Yoon looked at his face, which was overgrown with stubble, and thought that too should be tidied up. That night the sky was illuminated by the full moon, and the place where the mentor and student gathered was glowing from the lanterns. Yoon-ho was unrecognizable because just without the beard, he began to look 10 years younger. But the guy was a little excited about where they were going to go. The student was confused by the moment of such a crowded and lively place. And in addition, he admitted to the master that he had never been to such places before, but he had heard many different stories and only one of his friends was a real expert in this field. Cho clarified whether this only friend and student is from Incheon, confirmed that this is so, and from his friend's stories, Yoon knows that areas with red lanterns or flags are places where women sell their bodies. But in places with blue lights, there are performers who entertain guests with songs and dances and sell art objects. Mentor Cho smiled slyly and said that he also knew the basic information, but he did not bring Yoon here so that he could show off his knowledge, and invited the student to look at everything from the inside and study how everything was arranged. Namgung became even more agitated because he couldn't understand what the teacher was up to and what he even meant. Cho jokingly asked why Yoon continued to only ask instead of figuring it out himself, and pointing out that the night was short and they had a lot to do, he pushed the guy in a friendly manner, asking him to do something with his red face because Cho was ashamed to walk with him. The mentor went forward to the entrance to the house over which blue lights were burning, and the student stood in place looking after the master. Namgung Yoon-ho didn't understand at all what had just happened, but he really felt his face burning. For some reason, Yoon assumed that the case would be connected with Bakery Soul, but the master behaves completely unpredictably. With all these chaotic thoughts, the student overcame himself and still moved after the mentor. In a large house near which blue lanterns hung, guests were greeted properly and shown to them free seats. The servant asked the guests to wait a little and he would send the girl to them, to which Master Cho thanked for his concern and offered to enjoy alcohol for now. The servant bowed and thanked the honorable guest for the offer to drink with them. Cho Un turned towards the servant, actually offering the servant a drink and not out of politeness, and the man asked whether the guest really wanted to treat him to a drink. The servant, as follows the rules, took his leave and regretfully replied that he would not be able to repay the guest's kindness, and would also not be able to keep them company since he had to work. Yun-ho couldn't believe what he just saw, because the mentor offered a drink not to the Giseng who would come to entertain them, but to an ordinary servant. The servant poured the drink into cups lined up in a row, and once again apologized to the master, and insisted that he had to refuse, and then asked if he could help with anything else. Mentor Cho once mysteriously said that the warm spring was coming to an end when the servant asked how he could still help. Chui asked if the servant would take the third glass, to which the guy replied that the guest should give him any glass. The teacher looked carefully at the servant and said the fact that the guy could not take the glass himself. Cho turned the cup of drink over, pouring out the contents, and asked the servant if he could turn over another glass and give him the seventh cup. The servant silently accepted the guest's strange gesture at first glance and looked carefully at Cho. The servant realized that the guests were not here for fun, but that some other matter had brought them here, and he asked Cho if he wanted to buy or sell something. The mentor indicated that first he would like to buy something and at the same time he had something to sell. A servant trained in such things reacted instantly and told the guest to wait a little, and Cho did so while enjoying the drink. For some time, the teacher and student sat silently at a large round table. And if there were many cups in front of Cho and he continued to drink, there was one in front of Yun and he did not touch it. Namgung mistakenly asked the mentor what had just happened, and Cho calmly replied that this was a special code of the Hao clan. Yunho was amazed because he knew about the Hao clan, and these were those who are in the shadows and they are adherents of the neutral faction, that is, those who are called the lower stratum of society. But this is a huge organization created by marginalized people from all over the world, and they have the same huge information network when compared with the one owned by one of the pillars of the alliance. Elder Chwigulka has hundreds of thousands of beggars under his command as sources of information. And the Hao clan is an organization that uses people of humble class to obtain information, for example, a servant who cleans the house. Also, the informer of information can be a coachman carrying a drunken gentleman with his tongue loosened. A Kisang who pours alcohol on some gentleman is no exception. All these people are those with whom no one ever takes into account, so they can get anywhere, which meant that the Hao clan has eyes and ears everywhere, and it was this clan that created such a force and is the support of the neutral faction. Namgung is quite young and, due to his naivety, could not believe that in Wuhanjiang there was an organization of the Hao clan and also close to the evil faction, and the student anxiously asked the master if they should first inform the Murim Alliance, and the master replied that everybody knows. The mentor explained to the guy that not only the Hao clan has spies, but Elder Chwigulka, as one of the pillars of the Hwasan faction, also has his own informants, and as long as no one goes beyond what is permitted, everyone calmly turns a blind eye to what is happening. Yunho was surprised that teacher Hui knows so much besides the fact that he is also a talented teacher. The student was interested in whether the only branch of the Hao clan was here, and Cho Un explained that such dangerous people cannot settle in one place, so they constantly move around posing as traitors. Yun could not calm down his interest and asked the teacher how he knew that this was the Hao clan. But Hui snapped that their lesson was over for today and gave Yun the task of finding out how Cho found out about the Hao clan. Cho put a cloth bundle on the table in which was the same chest with silver won from Pakri Seoul. Namgung, having received both the lesson and the task, decided that it was time for him to go because the task required sobriety of mind. The student was leaving the house of entertainment and was so immersed in his thoughts that he did not notice the drunken exclamations of other guests. Many questions were spinning in Yun's head. For example, what did the mentor come to buy? And if he brought silver won from Seoul, then most likely it is connected either with her or with her family, and, in the end, what information does he want to receive? Namgung was distracted from the noisy thoughts in his head by someone's voice, and the man asked why someone like Yun from Dongcheon would be forgotten in such a place. It was clear from the man that he was already tipsy because he started asking Yun what kind of clothes he was wearing and that the guy looked like a rich man who decided to have fun with a giseng. And without waiting for Namgung's answer, the man offered to drink. The night mission had not yet come to an end, and although many were already asleep at that time, right now for Cho it was all just beginning. Mentor Hui was able to go where not always and not every person was allowed. In the room, an old man sat at a table with writings, greeted the guest, and introduced himself as Chong Yo, who was responsible for the branch in Wuhan. And the master was laconic, simply saying his name, Cho Un Hui. The old man raised his gaze a little at the guy in order to assess who this Cho Un Hui was. The elder concluded for himself that the mentor should have already been intoxicated by the giseng's laughter, but instead he needed an old man like him to which Hui asked to stop this game because he had only recently finished training the student. Cho smiled and explained in a friendly manner that he was tired and did not want to carry on empty conversations. The elder was amused by the young man's statement and advised him not to look down on the Hao clan, even if they were considered the lowest stratum of society. Cho called the old man talkative, to which he replied that the guest was ill-mannered, and asked if the mentor from Dongcheon had forgotten where to be. Asking if this was enough, Cho threw a piece of paper with a large number of hieroglyphs on the table, and then the old man's eyes, which had not really opened before, now widened because he read on the paper an inscription about 1,000,000 monetary units of nannies. Hui leaned his elbows on the table and said that he gets tired of this every time, so he asked the real head to come. A lady in a beautiful dress stood at the door and turned to her dear guest to take care of him, and she ordered the old man to go. Slowly swimming towards the mentor, the woman introduced herself as the head of the branch in Wuhan. The details of both her face and clothing were exquisite, like a work of art. The woman was dressed not too magnificently but not scantily, but in such a way as to emphasize her status, and her name was Yuran. On the table, in addition to treats and tea for the ceremony, there was a chest with silver won. Yuran asked how Cho found out that the old man was not in charge, and the master explained that someone who is not able to even watch the expression on his face cannot be the head. Mentor Cho closed the chest with silver won, indicating that they had something to talk about. Yuran noted this gesture for herself and realized that the person was in complete control of the situation. While Cho enjoyed the drink, the woman wondered where it came from and also concluded that her opponent was not just an ordinary martial arts school teacher. Yuran decided to check what Cho would say, and voiced that she did not think that they would be able to get such precious information. Cho always behaved evenly, and this time he replied that if the information was reliable, then there was no reason for him to save money. The woman, finally convinced of the guy's skill, said that in this case, sooner or later, even her heart might open to him. Mentor Cho was pleased that the conversation was finally proceeding normally, without obstacles in the form of doubts. Head Yuran did not take her dark and mysterious eyes like smoke away from Mentor Cho. The woman decided to try to take the master by cunning and play by her own rules and let seduction enter. But Mentor Cho remained faithful to only one woman, who once asked her to find her again, and therefore named what he really wanted from a woman. Namely, Hui came for information and specifically named what he wanted to know, and it was the great Pakri family and after Wuhanjiang. And the cherry on the cake was the master's desire to find out about the white dragon of the bakery Zhong Sun sword. Head Yuran did not expect such a turn at all, and was angry that the cunning move did not work. The woman realized that the guy was no slouch and was made of durable material, so she agreed to tell the information and started with the Pakri family. Having told supposedly reliable information, the woman asked if this was enough to satisfy the mentor's curiosity, and Cho replied that it was more than enough. And so Yuran made a second attempt to deceive the guy and, pretending to be innocent, said that the information provided exceeded the payment of 30 silver won, hinting that the master would show his generosity. Mentor Cho decided to play along with the woman and asked how much she wanted now, to which Yuran indicated the amount of 10 gold coins. Cho looked at the head and said that she was right and he had to pay, but at the same time indicating a condition if the information was indeed correct. Yuran did not like this statement that the master doubts the abilities of the Hao clan. The woman made the mistake of saying that the fact that she told was known to all of Kanho, to which Cho quite logically indicated that he had no need to come here for information that all of Kanho knew. Now Cho began to tell the woman that the rot began from within, and they were gradually losing their business, being deeply in debt. But Yu did not agree, citing the argument that the strength of great families is not determined only by gold. The mentor expressed his suspicion that the novice warriors stole all the property of the great family, so without wealth it was greatly weakened. The human factor of curiosity worked, and Chief Yu clarified whether it was all the work of the warriors, which greatly amused Cho. And the woman herself caught herself thinking that she accidentally asked a counter question, and now it turns out as if she was receiving information from the guy. Cho realized that the process had started and cast another bait in the form of rumors that soon the current head would appoint the next successor, and the woman already mechanically covered her mouth with her sleeve, so as not to say too much. But this time she couldn't resist. Yuran said that it is nonsense to appoint a new successor, since the current head of the house already has Bakery Junyoung, to which Hui gave her more information that the current successor is very weak in battle, so he will not become the head of the great bakery house. The woman realized that they had incorrectly interpreted the information received, and if anyone found out about this, the authority of the Hao clan would receive a blow. Cho Un asked about the woman's conditions at the beginning, that the price of information had increased to 10 gold coins, but immediately indicated that he had corrected the information she had received and asked to triple the price. The master also clarified that in order to remain silent about the mistake of the Hao clan, Head Yu should increase the amount 5 times, and after carrying out mathematical calculations, the mentor announced that 10 gold coins were 8 times each, and in the end his bet was 80 niang of gold. The woman was shocked by the scrolled diagram, and understood that in rare cases the clan pays 3 times more than it was initially, if someone helped with the interpretation of important information. In addition to this, the clan paid 5 times more if it was necessary so that no one was informed about their mistake to preserve their reputation, and Yu was more horrified by how this person knew their prices, which were practically inaccessible. The woman realized that she couldn't let the guy just leave and, hiding her hand below the table, gave a special sign. Cho, after taking a sip of his drink, told the head that there were too many listeners here for the information he was paying for. Continuing to sit at the table, the master waved his hand using his strength. The boards overhead crackled, and one of the spies began to fall from the ceiling. A man from a high ceiling fell straight onto his back, hitting the hard floor. The woman tried not to show it, but realized that the master reacted quickly, even without seeing her give a sign. Yuran was calm because there were 2 more assassins in reserve to protect her, and she also gave them a sign. Mentor Cho at that moment took 2 chopsticks in his hand. One stick flew like a bullet through a pillar in which cracks appeared. The second stick flew into the wall, also breaking through it and leaving cracks behind it. 2 dead bodies in dark clothes and black masks on their faces were flying from the wall and from the pillar. All this time they were behind the guests and they were all lying dead on the floor. Mentor Hui sat just as calmly in his place, and the woman was seriously frightened by the fact that in a matter of seconds she was left without protection. The master looked at the woman who was observing the bloody bodies and explained to her that the price must be paid with information. Yuran was numb with fear and turned to the guy, ready for the fact that she too would die. But Teacher Cho reassured her by saying that he was not going to hurt her if she gave him what he wanted, and clarified that he did not want to seem rude. So he removed 10 informational values from 80 niang. Shui poured the drink into the cup and continued that as an apology, he would deduct another 50 niang and only 20 gold coins would remain. He handed the cup of drink to the head, Yuran, who sat scared out of her wits. The woman did not take the cup, so Cho placed it in front of the woman and suggested that they now talk about Wuhanjiang. The poor thing drank a drink to somehow come to her senses and almost stuttering began to tell the information. Meanwhile, in a house with red lanterns, Namgung Yun Ho was sitting with a guy who, already drunk, met Yun in the corridor and dragged him to a drink. The red-haired young man, having already drunk a fair amount, laughed loudly and had fun. Student Yun told his friend about his mentor Cho Un Hui, and the drunk guy could not believe in the existence of such a person. The guy didn't even drink from the cup, but straight from the jug, and said that the mentor was quite an interesting person, and then he remembered that he didn't know how much time had passed since he laughed like that. Yun sighed in disappointment and told his friend that he had not changed a bit. The red-haired guy loudly declared that Yun, too, is still in the same situation, because his story with his mentor is the same as that he was first in the shadow of a smart younger brother and now subordinate to a more capable elder. But the guy smiled at this fact, saying that maybe it's not even bad. The drunkard grabbed the girl by the hand and dragged her to him, telling Yuna that it was not thanks to sympathy that they lived so wonderfully. The guy casually threw the gold coins onto the table, shouting that they were sending him as much money from home as he wanted. The young man continued to hold the girl's hand and shout out that his family had no expectations for him, so he would not let his family down. The girl tried to get out of the guy's strong grip, saying that she was an ordinary dancer, to which the young man threw a golden one into her hand and commanded her to dance her best dance. Yun remembered how he became close to Jay Kaltan because his friend was experiencing the same pain as Namgung because he was forgotten by his family, and the student realized that if he had not met his mentor, he might have become like Jay, and Yun suggested that his friend meet with Cho. Jay asked if Yun meant that madman and took a sip from the drink, and Namgung, in turn, told the guy to watch his tongue. He liked his friend's answer because before he was a mattress for him, but now the answer sounded convincing. Yun once again clarified that for Jay, a meeting with Mentor Hui would not be superfluous. Jay was already quite drunk and cheerful, so he agreed with Yun, saying that he had nothing to do because he was suspended from classes. Yun was surprised and asked what Jay meant by defamiliarization, And the guy, as if nothing had happened, cheerfully answered that he had recently beaten one mentor. Namgung's jaw almost dropped when he heard what his friend had done. Z explained that the mentor kept saying that he knew him and understood him, but the guy was infuriated by such expressions. Yoon silently accepted Jay's answer but still thought that his friend was a complete idiot. Jay, drunk again, said that if he makes another mistake or fails the exam, he will be kicked out and he will come to Dong Cheon. And then Yoon asked another alternative that his friend could be thrown out. Jay shouted that since his friend Yoon continues to talk like that, the guy can't pretend that he doesn't understand. And then it dawned on Namgung that he seemed to have made a mistake. On the street, the moon was still burning brightly in the sky, as if competing with the lanterns near the houses to see who was brighter. Meanwhile, Mentor Cho told Head Yu-ran that he heard everything he wanted and thanked the lady. The woman, already more dissatisfied than frightened, reproachfully said that she had no choice, and the master replied that there was nothing wrong with that because she just sold the information. Yu-ran remained silent, but realized that she had crossed the boundaries of what was permitted and told everything she knew. Mentor Cho voiced the fact that he does not understand a woman's heart because before that they had such a nice conversation, and now Yu-ran is acting so cold. The woman got angry because they touched a nerve, and she thought to herself that she was cold because she had completely lost to her mentor. Hui saw the changes on the lady's face and said that there was nothing to be offended about, and said that getting to know him was the best benefit for you. Head Yu couldn't believe her ears and asked what was profitable here, and Cho mysteriously replied that he didn't know. The lady was already completely confused and did not understand what this guy was talking about. Mentor Cho stood up and concluded that it was time for him to go, but Mrs. Yuran asked the master to stop. The head couldn't let her mentor go so easily after she was humiliated, and reminded that Cho said that he wanted to sell information and asked what it was. The master realized that he had done a good job and clarified whether the lady really wanted to know because it would cost a lot. Yuran said that she was ready to pay if it was worth it, and Cho again added fuel to the fire by saying that he could not trust someone who was surprised by 1,000,000 niang. The lady still knew her worth and was not going to sink below the plinth anymore, so she sternly replied that she makes decisions here. Cho was pleasantly surprised by the resilience of this lady and asked her to listen carefully and evaluate the information he was going to sell. Such information would shock any clan head because Cho said that this was about the end of the existence of the Hao clan. Head Yu-ran could not believe that the mentor was so simply talking about the collapse of the Hao clan. The woman decided for herself that she could not let this man go even if he died, so it would be better if he took her with him to the grave. For such cases, the lady always had protection with her, hidden in her sleeve in the form of a blade with a ring for her finger, and armed with it, Yu-ran understood that she needed to inflict at least one fatal blow on the master. Head Yu stood up from the table to implement her intentions, and Mentor Cho was already at the door at that moment. The woman bared her teeth like an animal, realizing that it was either now or never, but Hui was acutely aware of the danger behind him, so he stopped and half turned around. Cho looked at the lady with his amethyst eyes, which had already made many people horrified, and this time was no exception for the woman. It was as if she saw a ghost in front of her, and like everyone else, she saw murderous energy in those eyes and did not understand how someone like him could exist. Head Yu-ran was so scared that she swayed and had to lean on something. The lady realized that those who are in the clan are not opponents to this man, and since her body was weakened and did not obey, the blade flew off her finger and fell loudly to the floor. Yu-ran sat down because Cho did not have the strength to rely on energy, but he himself was pleased with the woman's obedience. Cho Un looked carefully at the head of the Hao clan and said that as a Kangho warrior, he could not leave in this way. The master quietly said that this was a list of traitors and kindly indicated to Head Yu that she could consider this a pre-sale tasting. With the help of her power, a list of traitors flew to the mistress's ear, and now only she knew this information. Yu-ran even touched her ear to hear better and to make sure that this was really happening to her now. On the table remained the only evidence that the lady was not alone today in the form of a vase and cups for drinks. The woman sat motionless not only because she had received a huge number of impressions during the evening, but also in order not to frighten off what had literally flown into her ears. Under the light of the moon, the statues on the houses took on a different appearance, as if they were about to come to life, flying into the sky. In front of the house, an excited Yoon was walking from side to side, and Mentor Cho was already approaching him. Namgung finally noticed the teacher and asked if he had finished his business, to which Hui replied in the affirmative. The mentor put his hand on Yoon's shoulder and, looking closely at the guy's face, asked if he had been drinking. The student hesitated, but replied that he really drank a little, after which Cho Un twisted the guy by the neck and jokingly said that while the mentor was doing hard work, his student was enjoying the drink at that time, and the master, satisfied, asked whether it was tasty. Yoon responded with relief that it was delicious, and the mentor laughed at him and was doubly pleased. Cho suggested that Namgung go to the kebab shop across the street and eat a few pieces of meat and then return to school. But the student was surprised that the master, having been in the magnificent cabana, now wants to go to an ordinary kebab shop. We jokingly told Yoon that if he doesn't want to, then don't let him do it, to which the student himself, already losing his saliva from imagining how he eats kebab, objected to the mentor that he didn't say at all that he didn't want to. Meanwhile, Sol was in Pakri's house, and judging by the way she was sitting with her legs crossed, something was bothering her. The princess held the fabric of her dress with her hand in a death grip and sat motionless. Sol was upset about something, and her gaze was full of sadness and worry. The girl seemed nervous, expecting something, and this only made things even more tense. Sol was sitting on a chair in front of the table where her family and father were just reporting on her achievement. Unlike the empty princess room in Dongcheon, here in the bakery house everything indicated status, such as a porcelain plate. On the other side of the room, a hand-painted porcelain vase sparkled with cleanliness. And also the screen with the image of mountains looked more like a work of art than an ordinary screen. The father read about his daughter's achievements and concluded that everything was even better than he expected. The gentleman praised the princess rather coldly and dryly, saying that it was a good job. The father added that he doubted his daughter's ability to cope with the budget he allocated. Next to the gentleman stood a son who sarcastically agreed with his father and then, in the same mood, called his sister small and untalented and, in addition, voiced his thoughts about where the girl could be used. The guy continued to throw mud at Salt, saying that even larvae like her can succeed, calling it a relief. But the father turned to Man Young so that his son would not forget that he was standing in front of him, so he needed to be more restrained, and the guy began to make excuses, after which he asked if Saul agreed that it was a relief that she was capable of something, and the poor thing said yes. The head of the family looked at his daughter and was pleased with the result, saying that he could now keep his promise. Brother Man immediately picked up his father's words and loudly declared that Mr. So will definitely take care of Saul because he's a big-hearted person. The mother also did not lag behind and explained that if everything goes well, the day will come when Saul will become the support of the head of the house, and the father confirmed this. The princess did not understand what they were talking about, but she knew that Mr. So had a huge trading guild and seemed to be close to her father. But Sol could not understand what kind of promise they made between themselves and why they were talking about it now. Someone said that in the end, she would also be able to take a worthy position in the family, and everyone would envy the princess, but this did not make it any easier for the girl, and she looked down at the floor, still crossing her legs in excitement. Sol didn't seem to notice them, but heard again that when she moved to the main house, it would be better to change all the furniture to new ones, and the princess silently accepted what she heard, and her father's severity returned to his face and voice. The head of the family rose above the table, saying that he would take care of the expenses and indicated to his daughter that she could now return. Saul, nervous and hesitating, called her father when he had almost left the room. The gentleman turned around with a very surprised look and said that he was not going anywhere. Sol grabbed her knees because her nerves were on edge and reminded her father of the promise she had made to her. The father frowned and looked at Saul with an almost withering look and asked what kind of promise it was. Little Saul said in a trembling voice that the promise was that when she finished with the new sword technique, her father would give her what she wanted. Mother and brother at that moment approached Saul, and Man told his sister that if she did something for the family, she should just be proud of it, and the mother picked up on this, adding that if the girl becomes too greedy, she will become useless because no one likes greedy women. The princess had to make a titanic effort so that important words for her would fly out of her mouth, and the little girl, plucking up the courage to ignore her mother and brother, turned to her father, declaring that she wanted him to keep his promise. The mother was shocked by such impudence, and the brother told his sister that she was old enough so she should stop being selfish. And when the head of the family got tired of this bedlam and a large number of exclamations, he said enough to everyone. Reluctantly, the father asked what his daughter wanted, while urging her to answer. Sol was glad that she was finally heard, but at the same moment knowing the severity of her father, at first she could not say anything. But nevertheless, again plucking up courage, she announced that she wanted to become a kanho master, that is to be a mentor and teach others martial arts. And now there is one last push left before the salt sounds loudly and confidently. The princess raised her head and screamed loudly that she wanted to learn all the techniques of the Pakri family. And after that, Sol said to herself in her thoughts that she had done it. But if the girl at that moment was proud of her courage to declare her own desires, the father was horrified. Sol looked at the floor and was very happy for herself that she didn't back down and praised herself. But Brother Man just opened his mouth and began to say, what kind of nonsense his sister is talking about now, when the father raised his hand, indicating to his son to stop and be silent. The father came close to Sol and said that since he promised, he should listen to his daughter. Sol was beside herself with happiness and asked again, just in case, whether her father would really listen to her. After which the father took his daughter by the shoulders and asked again whether the daughter wanted to be a master. And to this rhetorical question, he himself answered that Mr. So would support her in this endeavor. The brother was very amused by the way his sister found out about her father's plans for her. Sol seemed not to feel the ground under her feet, and being in prostration, she again asked what her father's words about Mr. So meant. The father explained that if Sol marries a member of that family, then the whole world will belong to her, and this cannot be compared with Kanho. And the mother agreed that having become the mistress of such a rich house, Sol will do whatever she wants, and Man also said that her sister will bathe in gold. The princess couldn't believe it, and a lot of questions were swarming in her head. Like, should she really get married? And why the hell are they talking about everything as if everything had already been decided? Sol cried out that the promise was different, because her father said that if she learned a new technique, he would allow her to do whatever she wanted. Sol clearly replayed their conversation, in which her father said that he would listen to her wishes when she finished improving her martial art. And it turns out that despite the understanding that it was harmful to her body, she went to the result like a warrior and tried her best. The father was unshakable and said that if his daughter gets married and gives birth to several children, she will be able to do whatever she wants. From the pain and injustice that is sprinkled on top with severity, Sol's teeth clenched. Tears flowed from her eyes in streams, and she shouted how they could all do this to her. A strict man is a frightened man who, behind a mask of severity, hides his fear of manifesting himself, even in emotions. And when he saw real tears and bitterness, his father decided to remove from sight what he himself was afraid of with a slap in the face. Sol was all afraid from both physical and mental pain that her own father could do this to her. The father stood attentively and looked at his daughter and concluded that she had picked up a lot while she was at school, and announced that her classes were over, so that she no longer needed to go to Dongcheon. So he ordered her to go there tomorrow and say that she was leaving. Sol stood with her face turned to the side and continued to stand, numb with horror. The princess realized why she had been called a priceless treasure all this time. Sol realized that she is a precious pearl that can be looked at and enjoyed, but in response she can only shine. The little girl wiped the blood from the corner of her mouth with her hand, and the words that she was a pearl that belonged to someone and could only shine dully echoed in her head. One day, Mentor Cho was watching Yoon's training when someone called the master and Mentor Yo appeared at the entrance. Mei was excited and asked if his student Bakery Sol had come to see Mentor Cho, to which the master answered in the negative. Cho explained that the last time the princess said that she would go home, but since then, he had not seen her, and asked Mei if something had happened. Yoon continued the training but heard the conversation between the mentors, and Mei said that Sol had recently visited her and apparently went straight away to meet with the head. And since the last person who trained Sol was Cho, she was a mentor and thought that maybe the master knew something. Cho, as always in his own manner, answered that he didn't know anything in particular and asked again what happened. Mei began to say that that day she was minding her own business in the library. Mentor Yo, like other masters, was looking for some information for herself on the shelves with records. And then she heard a rather familiar voice calling her, to which Mei naturally became distracted and turned around. Mentor Yo was terribly glad to have a guest who came to visit his master. At the entrance stood Sol, who shone brighter than the sun, and behind her, as always, her faithful assistant, Ryan Ryong. The girls sat down at the table to talk and drink aromatic, freshly brewed tea. Mei said that they had not seen each other for a long time, and that she had heard about the success of Sol and Mentor Cho in completing the technique, and also asked how the princess was doing now, to which the answer was that everything was fine. It was clear from Sol that she seemed to want to say something important, but she couldn't make up her mind. And then Sol looked down at the table and finally admitted why she had come today. The silence was broken by Mei's shout to the entire hall, asking if the princess was leaving. Mentor Yo was very surprised and said that Sol trained harder than anyone, And just like that, she suddenly quit studying, and of course, May asked if something had happened. The little girl replied that something really happened, but she assured the teacher not to worry because nothing critical had happened. Sol, who had just laughed, suddenly changed her face, but it was unclear whether it was sadness or pain. Teacher May just froze, waiting for the princess's answer, and just watched. Sol placed a neat package in front of the mentor with a request to accept it from her. May was a little confused, but began to unwrap the fabric and asked the student what it was. The package contained a beautiful pendant with flowers, and Sol explained that it was a farewell gift that she bought, thinking that it would look great on the hilt of her mentor's sword. May, as befits a master, said that she could not accept something so expensive. But Sol smiled again, reminding her that she was a priceless treasure, so it was not such an expensive gift, so she asked May not to be shy and take it. This is what alarmed Mentor Yo, because the sudden changes in emotions and with them leaving and a farewell gift did not look like the usual behavior of a student. Having told about the meeting, May continued to explain to Hui that Sol suddenly, out of the blue, started talking about leaving, and her intuition tells her mentor that something happened to the girl. Yomei carefully and silently looked at Cho and then asked if the master had made a mistake while teaching the princess. But Hui remembered that, in fact, he had not done anything special at all and just shook his head. May continued to think that even if Cho is not to blame, if the official representative of the Paikri family leaves the school, then Mentor Hui will get a bad deal from the head of Zhong. Now Cho started to get nervous and couldn't understand why he would get into trouble, to which May simply replied that it was all because it was the great Paikri family. Mentor Yo explained that if Sol herself expelled, it would damage the reputation of their school. And as Cho knows, head Zhong really wants to work at the Incheon school, so he values his reputation very much. And in order to finally finish off the mentor, May explained that if a student suddenly decided to leave 10 days after changing the mentor, then it would be the mentor who would be blamed for this. Cho wondered if Sol did this because he just watched her for 10 days. But then he remembered that they had discussed everything. May noticed the expression on Cho's face and almost shook the soul out of him, demanding to tell him what he knew and why Sol decided to leave. Like thunder in broad daylight, a scream rang out at Dongcheon School, and it was the name of Master Cho. The voice screamed and called the mentor, growing more and more and approaching where the guy was. And the one who shouted was already at the door of the library where the mentor was sitting. With the words, "What are you doing?" Herod opened the doors, and if the other masters realized that this was the end, Cho, as always, ate. Mentor Hui tried to put on a cute face again and joke about a warrior of marriageable age. Zhong ordered him to shut up. Hui absolutely calmly asked why the head was yelling at him and asked what happened, and Zhong was even more angry from the guy's reaction. Behind Zhong's back, as always, stood his right hand in the form of the nasty toad Yoma, and the head began to explain that the student Bakery Soul came to him and said that she wanted to expel. The mentor, yawning sweetly, pretended to be surprised and asked why she made such a decision. Out of nerves, Zhong began scratching the back of his head and could not bear these stupid questions from Cho, as if he did not understand anything. The head began to mention to the mentor that Sol decided to leave 10 days after the guy took responsibility for her training, and she had to inform the first mentor about this and the mentor already to the head, but Cho logically replied that Zhong himself came. The head did not stop and shouted that how could a student escape from a responsible mentor and not even say a word to him, and Cho sighed heavily but remained silent. And then Hui looked thoughtful and said that Sol was initially so unshakable because she is still a Kanho warrior. And this was the last drop of head Zhong's anger that fell into the boiling vat. Turning to the mentor so that he turned his face in the right direction, Cho launched a notebook. And with shouts that the guy was a damn brat, head Zhong began to throw notebooks at the mentor one after another, but the guy waved them aside with ease. We got tired of this, and catching one of the notebooks, the guy said that the head is absolutely right, so Cho should go somewhere. As it turned out, the toad was holding a stack of notebooks that the head shot at the guy. But Zhong stopped after the mentor's statement. Cho rose from the table, holding the notebook he had caught in his hands, and headed to the entrance where Yom and Jun were standing, telling them that he wanted to go to Baikri Sol's house. Hui put the notebook on a stack, and taking Yom by the shoulder with one hand so that the poor guy grimaced, told the mentor that his shoulders were very tense, and the guy replied to Zhong that as the head of what he wanted, he would go and find out what happened. Before leaving, Cho smiled and asked Jun to give him a pass so he could get to the Baekri family. To get from one place to another, you had to walk among the walls along a cobblestone road. Cho carried a cloth bundle and also took a sword with him, and walking along this road, he told himself what a deserted area this is. Hui looked at the high walls and didn't understand what people found in them, because you couldn't even see what was happening next door. Cho continued walking, but the further he walked, the more he realized that he didn't like it. While the mentor was walking, he analyzed that truly beloved children would not talk about themselves like Saul. Cho remembered how the girl called herself the princess of the great Pakri family and that she was a priceless treasure. The mentor also remembered Saul's words that in her huge room, one could feel how her family cared for her. But just like Yun noticed that the room was empty, the mentor also did not ignore this. Cho wondered if a child who was madly loved would be abandoned to live in an empty room with nothing. Wee continued on his way, preparing for the fact that perhaps everything was much worse than he had imagined. The guy came to the Pakri house, at the door of which there were 2 guards. One of the guards asked who the guy was, and Cho replied that he was a mentor from a martial arts school. Since the guards received news from Cho Un, they let the mentor through, and he walked further along the huge square that led to the house itself. Almost reaching the door, someone from the side shouted the name of the mentor, and the guy was surprised. Cho turned around, and a frightened Ryong was running towards him, shouting something about her mistress. Meanwhile, in the house, the lanterns illuminated all the pomp and luxury of the home. Precious vases stood polished to a shine on the shelves and shone like diamonds. The table was set in the best possible way, with all the delights both in food and in dishes and cutlery. The head of the Pakri family, as well as his son Man and the honorable guest, Mr. So, were sitting at the table. The father ordered the servant to hurry up and invite Saul to enter their hall. Like a bird in a beautiful long dress with flowers, Salt floated across the floor. The servants announced that the lady had arrived, and the guest immediately looked in the direction where Salt was. The girl was more beautiful than the most delicate flowers on her dress, but her face was so unhappy that the color of her eyes dimmed. Mr. So was delighted with the so-called agreement, saying that the princess was indeed incredibly beautiful, and added that her beauty made his heart ache, and he was happy that he would see this face for the rest of his life. The father asked his daughter to sit down at their table in the place reserved for the princess, next to the gentleman. At the large round table, only one place reserved for the mentor was empty. Sol did not eat or drink, but only sat with her eyes downcast at the table, while the honorable guest drank and looked at the beauty of the girl. The little girl sat and understood that this was the end, but she still couldn't understand why it all turned out this way. Sol thought that it would be wrong to follow the words that she should live for the sake of her family and for their benefit. But was she really unable to escape from home because she was not beaten here? The question came to the princess if it was because she had kept hope in her heart until the very end, harboring unrealistic expectations. Tears began to fall onto Saul's hands from a terrible state of hopelessness. But where there seems to be no hope in sight, everything is just beginning, and the servants announced that a mentor from the Dongcheon martial arts school has arrived. The doors opened, and the first thing you could immediately see were bright amethyst eyes. Mentor Cho entered the hall in the same place as Ryong and looked at where the guests were talking at the table. Sol noticed a man who was perhaps closer and more pleasant than everyone who was sitting at the table with her now. Cho also met the girl's gaze, and so far the mentor's eyes were calm. The head of the family looked at the fact that the mentor was not standing alone, but next to him was Ryong. The master, without even greeting Cho, asked if the maid knew this man. Ryong responded in the affirmative, indicating that this was Cho Un, the instructor in charge of the lady. When Cho came closer to the table, the gentleman told him that his daughter told him a lot about the master and asked if it was true that Cho had helped her a lot. The mentor remained silent and looked at Sol, who sat drooping. Cho realized that the girl was now terribly embarrassed by the fact that her mentor was present here now. The master realized that the girl was apparently ashamed that he had suddenly appeared at her wedding with a man who was old enough to be her father. But in order not to stretch the pause into awkward silence, Cho answered the head that he, as a mentor, was good at it. The father laughed, saying that the guy was quite brave, but usually many people could not utter a word in his presence. The gentleman was interested in the fabric bundle in the hands of the mentor, and he asked what was inside. Cho put the package on the table and replied that there were pennies that were given to him the other day, and that's why he was here to return them, because it seemed wrong to the master. The father opened a chest in which were the same 31 that had already visited the queen of the Hao clan, and were even able to return to where they came from. The head replied that he was sorry that such a precious person had to come all this way for the sake of some insignificant amount of money. Sol again became convinced that, as it turns out, if 30 silver won is nothing for a father, then what can we say about the happiness of his daughter? The father just shouted the word "hey" to the servants, and they did everything as needed, as if they already knew what to do. While the servant was carrying and placing a larger chest on the table in front of Cho, The head said that his child was still immature and could not properly present a return gift, and added that it would be quite suitable for a reward, meaning what was in the chest. In front of Cho stood an open chest with just gold ones, and there were an order of magnitude more of them. The head apologized for the mistake of his stupid daughter and asked the mentor to accept this chest. Cho scratched the back of his head and replied that if he accepted this gift, he might get into trouble. The father was amused again and replied that he was not going to offend the instructor who diligently trained his child, who really lacked a lot. And Hui thanked the head for his words, but could not speak further because the master said that in this case he also has conditions. Having changed his face to a formidable man, the head said directly that he had heard that the mentor was well versed in martial arts. And the head of Pakri asked his mentor if he would like to work with him. Cho replied that cooperation with the head of Pakri would be difficult. A man who was rarely refused because he had wealth and power, it was very surprising to hear such an answer. Therefore, Hui explained to the head that they were prohibited from combining mentoring with other work. Mr. Pakri laughed loudly and menacingly because for him nothing was impossible if you had money. The head understood but was not happy that the mentor did not like his generous offer, and the gentleman gestured forward with his hand to the guards with swords standing behind him. The guards were already trained like watchdogs, so they slowly moved towards Hui, taking their swords out of their sheaths. Both guards stood behind the mentor, awaiting further instructions from their master. The head of Pakri grinned and suggested that Cho think carefully because the proposal would be in force for some time. Master Hui didn't even twitch a nerve on his face, but he just looked at this bastard, who decided to ask the question again. The head looked with his dissatisfied and stern gaze and asked the guy if he would accept his offer. Mentor Cho held the tyrant's gaze, looking at him still exactly without a single movement or emotion. And after a pause, Hui said that this was too important a conversation to have in front of strangers. The owner of the house replied that Mr. So is not a stranger and that they will soon become a family. Cho, despite the fact that he could have been killed at any moment, sarcastically noted that there seemed to be a misunderstanding, and he did not notice the love in the eyes of those present. The head of Pakri warned the guy to watch his language and pointed out that Lord So is not the person with whom an ordinary mentor can talk like that. Mr. So himself laughed, embarrassed by the words of the head, and said that everything was fine. Seo said that how could it be that there were no feelings in a man's eyes when he looked at his bride and turned towards Seol, to which Cho grimaced and pointed out that the man looked old for this. So disagreed with the guy, saying that he and the princess did not have such a big age difference, and thought that this was not an obstacle because he was ready to love and care more than anyone. Mr. So, while he was talking about great love, took out a scroll from under his bosom and told the guy to look, and unfolded it. The picture showed a woman exactly flying out. The salt seemed to have been created as a carbon copy. While So was asking if this woman doesn't look like Pakri's soul, only that in the picture she is a little older, the mentor could not contain the surprise that jumped out on his face. So introduced the woman as his ex-wife, and explained that he proposed to Saul because it seemed to him that she was the reincarnation of his ex-wife. So asked if the guy now understood what was in his heart, and Saul, looking at the picture, was horrified by what was happening. Unexpectedly for everyone, the mentor let out a loud laugh, although before that he stood emotionless like a rock. So hid the scroll back under his clothes, and now, instead of love, there was misunderstanding in his eyes, just like Saul's. The rest of the Pakri family members also seemed to have changed places with their mentor, because if he was laughing now, those sitting at the table had a stony expression on their faces. Cho, smiling, turned to Saul, asking her if she also thought all this was funny. And as if Cho had a piece of immortality somewhere in his pocket, he declares to So's face that he cannot believe that a toad like him had such a charming wife, and wondered if the uncle had confused a dream with reality. Sol realized that things were bad because her creepy father heard it too, and she was filled with cold, which is why she twitched. The owner's fist hit the table like a sledgehammer, causing the furniture to shatter into splinters. And screaming like an angry beast, the head of Pakri turned to the mentor that he was going to be polite with him, but the guy crossed all boundaries. The guests stood around the wooden parts that used to be a round table and looked at Cho. The owner shouted that such an ill-mannered youth should know his place, and gave the command to his watchdogs to draw their swords. Hui was glad that finally it wouldn't be so boring. He asked Sol what they would do, and Cho questioningly said that he could kill everyone here. The poor thing, already frightened, shouted how the master could joke in such a situation. But Cho, showing his beautiful amethyst eyes, said that he was quite serious and warned the princess to think carefully before answering, because her fate would depend on him. Sol realized that the mentor was really not joking, and the main lever for her to wake up was the word fate. The girl repeated these two words in her head, my destiny, as if regaining herself. Saul looked carefully at the faces of her seemingly dear people who almost sold her today. And maybe the princess would have changed her mind. But then the mother ordered her daughter to go in their direction and quickly, and the brother, as always with a dissatisfied face, pointed out why his sister was just standing there and that she was, as always, narrow-minded. After the words spoken in her direction, the girl changed her hope into something of anger, which had not yet fully revealed itself. But Cho, unlike everyone else, was pleased, and even said that the princess should take her time and think. And after the mentor told Sol that she even had time to think, he broke the chair lying in front of him so that two strong legs remained. Cho deftly threw these legs upside down and they ended up in his hands. Sol, most likely, having given her consent, warned the master that he should be careful because these are warriors raised by her father, and Cho, laughing at the fact that everything was only becoming more interesting, answered the princess well. From the entrance, warriors with swords rushed towards Cho like two trained bulls. Chui stood with sticks from a chair and was already ready to greet such frisky guests. Cho wielded sticks no worse than the warriors wielded their swords, and when they reached the place where the guy stood, the master was at the entrance in the blink of an eye. The mentor caught two fighters when he changed places with them and they got hit. While Cho stood with his back to everyone, a warrior was already running towards him, screaming and also armed with a sword. The warrior swung and punched, but missed because Cho was skilled at dodging. The mentor decided to lighten up this boring action a little and tilted the chest with the silver coins that he had brought today with his foot. Cho kicked two silver one to the level of his hands and prepared his finger for the strike. With two resounding blows on there, the mentor gave them the direction as if they were bullets. The silver ones crashed into the warrior's chest with terrible speed and he screamed in frantic pain. The fighter fell to the floor and Mentor Cho remained standing in front of him with his hand raised. Smiling, the master told the princess that first he would get rid of the garbage that was preventing her from collecting her thoughts. The warrior who was hit in the chest by Cho with silver fell to the floor face down. Sol could not resist and asked how the master defeated the warrior only with Wanami, to which the mentor reminded the princess that he had told her that he was good at everything he undertook. But the girl exclaimed that the mentor did not say, but what she remembers is the possession of a sword, a club, a spear, a knife, and a bow. Hawaii smiled and asked if he had only named such a short list and took his sword out of its sheath. In front of the mentor stood the owner, and on both sides of him, just like those dogs, stood two more warriors. The head of Pakri indignantly hid that the guy was hiding the real level of his skills. But Cho proudly stated that he never hid his skills and added that it was the head who did not know the basics. The father ordered his watchdogs to take Sol away from here, still considering the girl his property. One of the warriors began to say that the lady should come to them, but could not finish speaking to the end. The one who couldn't finish speaking had something hit him right in the forehead, and the second warrior in the chest in the area of the heart. The owner only had time to watch his two guards fall face down on the floor. The head of Pakri saw that near the unconscious warrior there was a silver one from which both guards fell. The owner, holding his sword, muttered through his teeth that he was trying to be lenient with the guy, but he was not going to tolerate someone hurting his people and misleading his precious child. Fueling the flames of rage inside, the head of Pakri threatened the mentor that the guy would not get away with just an apology. Sol was truly afraid of her father and tried to persuade him to stop. The daughter pleaded with the head of Pakri to forgive her mentor Cho, because she knew what kind of father could be furious. But the owner of this house made a huge mistake by shouting to the defenseless girl to shut her mouth. Head Patri, although he was angry and terrified if you looked at him, he still did not fully understand who he had contacted and who his opponent was. Mentor Cho was not a timid type, and it is said about such people that he literally laughs in the face of danger. The head of Pakri kicked the floor and, repeating the technique, Cho swung his sword and struck the stones while they were in the air. With this, the owner wanted to distract the guy, and while he was dodging the stones, the head would kill him, but not in the case of Cho because he had already violated the plan and was focused on the enemy while knocking off the stones. The head ran furiously with a sword at the guy, while Cho, in addition to his sword, also had a stick from a chair in his hands. And Cho Un would not have been Cho Un if he had not figured out how to use a chair leg, namely repeat the same meanness as the owner with the stones. The head of Pakri waved away the wooden pieces, calling them pathetic tricks. But no matter how pitiful they were really tricks because while Pakri was distracted by sticks, Mentor Cho kicked his sword off the floor. And now the guy is already standing with two swords, having a serious advantage over the head. Pakri realized where everything was leading, namely to the mentor's use of the double blade technique. Cho, as happy as a child, told Saul to watch carefully because this is a special and perfect method of using two blades. The master made certain movements similar to flapping his wings right in front of the head. The blades of the blades passed quite close to Pakri's face, leaving behind an amethyst glow, which is why the old man even had to close his eyes. The mentor made a jump and entered the battle, dancing with swords, and all that remained for the owner at that moment was to at least put up a defense in front of himself with the help of a sword. Pakri had to lean with his whole body to withstand Hui's blow, but the old man's legs began to move along the floor. For the first time that evening, the head realized the scale of the problem and what he had gotten himself into. And the mentor's power only began to grow, and Cho, as always, was glad of what he felt at this moment. The mentor again made a jump and hit the defense of the head of Pakri with a double blow, causing the old man to stagger. The owner could only keep his defense in front of him because Cho struck blow after blow like a hurricane. The old man was both scared and angry that for the first time he couldn't cope with the situation. There was someone stronger than him. Sol, who had been watching the battle all the time, could not believe what she saw as Master Hui pushing her father aside. Cho, spitting sarcasm as if it were poison, called the head of the White Dragon of the Sword, and added that he should come to the martial arts school, and he, Hui, as his instructor, would teach the old man how to properly handle the sword. Such words hurt Pakri's pride, and he yelled at Hui's mentor that he was a degenerate. The greedy anger that was raging inside the head spread to his weapon, making the sword look as if it had just been pulled out of the brazier. The sword glowed with a red flame and was heated to white, which indicated the release of energy outward. Saul looked at her father's transformation and realized that everything was only getting worse. The girl shouted to Mentor Cho that it was the energy of the sword that had manifested itself, and asked the master to be careful. Master Cho looked at how uncontrollably Pakri used the energy of the sword and held steady because he knew that at the very peak, only those who enter the realm of the highest mastery can barely comprehend it. Hui heard Saul's warning, but he also knew that there was nothing in the world that could not be cut, and the sword itself was no exception. Pakri put strength and anger into his sword swing, but without proper control and self-discipline. Cho, in turn, always approached the battle wisely and accordingly put up a defense in front of himself. But since the technique was tied to a dance with two blades, the mentor connected another blade to the blade that held the head sword, thereby making a blow. The old man could barely hold on to this power, and on top of that there was the blinding light from the blades. Quite unexpectedly, blood poured out of the head's mouth after Cho crossed blades. His legs no longer obeyed his master, and Pakri slipped halfway away from his mentor. Trying to hold on with his hand, the head continued to move across the floor further and further from the master, and Cho understood that Pakri Chong-sun was unable to strengthen the sword only because of his skills. The mentor saw Chan spit out blood from his mouth and realized that he had clearly suffered damage to his internal organs as a result of the blow. Hui crossed his blades over his head, deciding for himself that it was time to end this useless battle. And then the mentor lowered the swords to the ground, as Saul once told him to start with this. It was by the two swords lowered to the floor that Saul understood what the mentor was going to do. Master Cho brought the sword together in front of him in two sweeping movements, leaving an amethyst trail. The swords rang out with their blades facing each other, and this was the end of the Pakri Saul technique. Therefore, after drawing the swords back, an amethyst crane ascended in front of Mentor Cho. This was the final blow aimed at the head of the bakery family, Jong-sun. The old man spat out even more blood, as if from an explosion, and flew to the end of the hall. Jong-sun, like a doll, fell to where he had shown his menace at the beginning and broke the table with his fist. At this point, the duel was completed, and in front of the owner of the house stood the man to whom Chan did not show respect. Mentor Cho turned to Saul and, being terribly pleased, asked how she liked what she had just highlighted. While the girl was afraid to move and looked at her father lying on the floor, Cho explained to her that he had just completed her white crane ascension technique. Poor soul, having experienced so much humiliation and being now very frightened, could do nothing more than cry. She cried because finally someone stood up for her and was able to free her from the golden cage. The mother could not believe that her husband was lying on the floor, and the son said in a trembling voice that his father had really failed. With a hoarse voice from the blood in his throat, Chan Bakery tried to curse at his mentor, and Cho drew attention to this. Trembling and holding his ribs but rising to his feet, Chan asked what kind of tricks the mentor used. Chan stood bent over and breathing heavily, and told himself that this was impossible and that he had never seen such a level of sword control. Cho looked at the shabby old man indifferently and asked him if he really was such a fool. The mentor took Saul by the wrist and led him forward towards his father. Chan Bakery was barely sitting on the floor on his knees, But Cho was determined and walked towards the head so that Sol could barely keep up with him. Mentor Hui came close to Chan and sharply pushed the old man in the chest and knocked him onto his back. The master took out a notebook from under Chan's clothes, where the technique of wielding a double blade was written. Hui held the notebook over Jungkook to make sure he really saw it, and told the old man to look at it. Chan could hardly speak, but he stood up and asked his mentor what he was holding in his hands, and that was his best technique for wielding a double blade. Teacher Cho held the notebook in front of everyone and explained that mastery of the double blade is rare, especially if warriors study old-school martial arts. Hui pointed to Merchant So and asked if this was the man who brought the notes, and then asked how an ordinary merchant managed to find the mysterious technique, and So's face changed dramatically. The mentor interpreted the situation more clearly for those present, explaining that this technique cannot be quickly mastered without guidance and only with talent, because the technique belongs to the demonic art, and So began to deny. Sol asked the mentor if she understood correctly that Cho wanted to say that Mr. So was a demon, but Hui responded negatively, arguing that that was why So tried to use someone else to complete the technique. Sol was horrified to hear from the master that the mind control technique was used to complete it. Mind control is used with the help of drugs and hypnosis, thanks to which you can penetrate the weakened mind of a person and strengthen his negative emotions and then turn the person into your puppet. The princess realized that it turned out that her father all this time was not a father at all. The daughter looked at her exhausted father and wondered if all this meant that he was not himself right now. Sol turned to Mentor Cho, asking what needs to be done to dispel the mind control. Hui looked at the girl, trying to understand if she would be ready for such an answer. After a pause, Cho still replied that if you kill the sorcerer, you can free yourself from control. No matter how sweet and gentle this girl seemed from the outside, she immediately turned her gaze full of determination to where So was. So sat on the floor and could not believe that the princess was now actually picking up the sword from the floor. The merchant sat and trembled, but did not move from his place, and Sol walked towards him with a sword in her hands. The girl looked at So, and in her eyes one could read the irrevocable decision that had already been made. Merchant So, still trembling with fear, sat on the floor and looking at the princess asked her for mercy. So backed away but pressed close to the wall, and Cho, as a true mentor, was nearby even now, and told the student that if she wanted she could stop and leave, but if she killed the merchant, there would be no turning back. Sol brought the sword in front of her and firmly told the master that she could do it. Cho took the girl by the hand in which the sword was, and holding it, tried to dissuade her and think again, explaining that she could return to her old life. She just needed to forget today. The mentor continued to persuade the girl to simply live on as a precious treasure of the Pakri family, but these same terrible words worked as an advantage, and Sol said that she had decided everything. Cho Un said that Sol was indeed a very headstrong student and asked the princess to look at him, but he thought to himself that he was working for such a pittance and there was so much hassle. Sol opened her eyes and told her mentor that she had already chosen which path she wanted to go. The master was surprised, but answered that he was very sorry and let go of his hand, and given the weight of the sword, Sol's hand began to fall down on Mr. So. The sword flew straight at Mr. So's head and he screamed furiously, covering himself with his hands. Sol was already holding the sword with both hands, but she closed her eyes so as not to see the man's death. But when the princess opened her eyes, she saw that there was no blood at all. Cho held his sword so as to kill not a person but a more important enemy, and so lay unconscious like a doll that had been gutted. The sword with which Sol wanted to kill So pierced the package that the merchant showed, where his ex-wife was drawn terribly similar to the princess. When the mentor explained that there is no law according to which a sorcerer is considered a full-fledged person, the scroll caught fire. The painting burned, and along with it what was put into it by someone evil and greedy. Cho told Sol that this is a soul absorption technique, and it involves the fact that every time a human heart breaks into pieces, the demon seems to draw lines on it one after another. The master concluded that when the complete picture is completed, he can easily take possession of a person's soul. And as soon as the mentor finished his words and the scroll burned, a black entity appeared in the hall and screamed piercingly, as if from the underworld. We understood who they had called, and therefore held Princess Sol behind her back with one hand. Hiding the girl behind him, the master had a sword in his other hand, which he pointed towards where the entity was. When Cho swung his sword to awaken his energy, an amethyst train trailed behind the weapon. And after the swings and with his energy, Mentor Cho threw the blade towards the entity. The amethyst beam flew straight into the black clot of demonic power. The sword illuminated the silhouette of a small woman who took the blow of the weapon with her bare hands. The heavy and thick blade of the blade froze in her small hands, as if she were holding a stick and not a piece of iron. The servant's eyes burned with a red flame, and due to the fact that the human body could not withstand such force, the veins in his hands bulged. In a creepy, hellish voice, little Ryong looked in the direction of Cho Un's soul and growled how they could do this. The princess looked at the girl whom she had recently allowed closest to her and considered her faithful assistant, and could not believe how she saw her now. The head of the family, Paikri-chan, also could not believe his eyes and realized that there had been a monster at his side and his family all this time. Mother and son also did not expect such a transformation from the inconspicuous and gray little servant. And then it became clear that Merchant So had no intention of getting married at all, but was only part of the plan. The demon turned to the mentor, asking how he found out about everything, and Cho, smiling, replied that the servant was close to her mistress, but at the same time she watched her train until exhaustion. But Cho made an assumption, unless the demon had other motives to watch the mistress's torment, and the monster was angry that the master knew everything from the very beginning. Saul looked at her savior and couldn't comprehend how he had just managed to understand everything. Cho knew that in order to complete a harmonious marriage union, Pakri Saul had to be mentally and physically exhausted. While the princess stood and looked at Ryong Ryan, whom she trusted with her life, Master Hui understood that the soul absorption technique would only work when free will was completely eliminated through constant suppression and breaking of the mind and body for a long time. The technique is quite difficult to use, but as soon as someone is caught, he becomes a puppet forever. And the demon needed a woman, and Saul was the ideal candidate, because if it were a man, he would be too strong and the technique would not work. The mentor finally remembered among his incarnations that it seemed to him that he had seen Pakri Saul somewhere, and realized that in the future, it was she who was called the Red Witch. Chui realized that at that time the body of the Red Witch was possessed by an evil spirit, and in the future, as a result of this forbidden technique, her body weakened and she died. And having compared what the mentor already knew and knows, he now concluded that this red-haired witch could not leave the body of Salt, who had the talent of heaven. Having completed the dialogue with himself in his head, the teacher smiled and thought that this would never happen again. The demon got tired of waiting and using his power began throwing blows towards Hui and Saul. In front of the mentor and the princess stood the guard who received the first blows of the demon. As far as the guards had enough strength and training, they fought off the demonic blows with their swords. The guards shouted for the others to quickly protect the master and madam, and also for the madam and young master to be taken out of here. The guards shouted to each other to stop the demon no matter what, and that help would arrive soon. But this did not stop the monster, and it continued to cause damage. The master simply stood and, as if playing a sports game, repelled the demon's blows, covering the Salt with himself. The princess looked at Hui and asked if he would just stand and watch. While the demon was stronger than all the guards who attacked him, Cho asked Sol if she wanted to help. Sol asked the mentor whether it would be dangerous if the evil spirit escaped and the demon heard this. The princess added that if the light and dark factions find out about this, they can be executed immediately. And Cho, scratching the back of his head, said that apparently he has no choice. The demon made an effort to repel the last guards and turned towards the exit. The spirit bared its teeth and warned that today he would leave, but for what they had done, he would never forgive. The demon ran to the exit, and Hui, sighing heavily, told the spirit that nothing could be done and shouted to listen to his order. The master told the demon to look at him, and the evil spirit, obeying, stopped at the door. The demon turned to the one who was stronger and looked at him with his red, cursed eyes. The spirit saw a man who was blazing with an amethyst flame, showing that he was a difficult person. Poor Ryan's face looked terrible from the presence of the spirit in her body, but the demon, as indicated, looked at the mentor. The master calmly continued to be in the same place and said the next order to obey him. Because of the order to submit, the body turned black like coal, and the red eyes were not visible, and the spirit screamed furiously. The demon grabbed his face with his hands where his eyes were and let out terrible screams. In pain, the spirit tore his face with his hands and screamed because his eyes were burning alive. The demon bent over and continued to scream, and his pitch-black eyes fell into his hands. Hui stood and watched the torment of the evil spirit while continuing to radiate his power. Due to the fact that the body was human, tears flowed from the empty eye sockets, and the demon wanted to say something about this man. But the thoughts and words of the spirit were interrupted by the master's last word, and he commanded the demon to disappear. After which, Du gritted his teeth, and the body began to collapse. The human shell splashed with blood, as if the body was being torn apart from the inside. The mentor just stood idly by and watched as the remains of the man fell, illuminating the entire room with amethyst light. The red ribbon that held the guy's hair broke, just like every time he uses his power. The ribbon was torn due to the fact that the master's hair stood up along with the energy that he released. Cho stood and looked in front of him, and in complete darkness, along with his whole body, bright amethyst eyes glowed.